The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the Society of Massage Archives. These interviews and commentaries represent the recollections of both the hosts and the guests, and as such, are subject to the occasional slight inaccuracies. The content here is for informational and educational purposes only. You should conduct your own historical research when determining the veracity of any of the statements made within. Greetings and welcome to the Hands of History podcast, a production of the Society of Massage Archives, where we delve into the rich tapestry of massage therapy's past, explore its evolution, and share the stories that have shaped this vital practice. Today is Monday, February 10th, 2025. I'm your host, Kirby Clark Ellis, and I'm joined today with George Kousaleos. As a Harvard graduate in the early 1970s, George worked as a substance abuse counselor and attended classes at the Florida State University. Following a cervical injury and concussion playing rugby in 1975, George was introduced to massage therapy and began massage therapy training. By 1978, he was a member of the charter class for the SOMA Institute of Neuromuscular Integration and quickly became an assistant instructor in Somassage. During the next 11 years, George would go on to instruct Somassage seminars in the US, Canada, Greece, and Austria, and brought the first SOMA Institute program to Germany. In 1990, George and Patricia Kousaleos opened the Core Institute School of Massage Therapy and Structural Integration in Tallahassee, and would go on to prepare over 2,000 students for Florida State licensure during the next 25 years. The Core Myofascial Therapy Certification Program has also been taught by George to thousands of practitioners throughout the US and in 11 countries total. George has served on the NCB-TMB, helping to develop the certification exam and write the bylaws for NCB-TMB, the Massage Therapy Foundation as vice president during its infancy. In the mid-1990s, George became the general manager of sports massage for the British Olympic team during their training at Florida State and was instrumental in assisting Benny Vaughn during the 1996 Olympic Games in Athens, Georgia, recruiting and training massage therapists to provide massage for the athletes competing, a first in modern massage therapy history. In 2002, George and 4 other leading practitioners were asked to organize an international team to work with the sports medicine department for the 2004 Athens Olympics. Over 170 massage professionals from 19 countries, covering 9 languages, and it was the largest group of practitioners to work for the Olympics and Paralympics. George's work during the 2010s largely focused on work with football teams, which opened doors to sports massage for the majority of FSU's varsity sports team, and would lead George to work with practitioners assisting collegiate football players training to improve their position in the NFL draft. Many of George's students in those seminars would go on to secure positions with NFL teams and or work with NFL athletes as independent contractors. George continues to train practitioners in the Core Institute programs of structural integration, myofascial therapy, and sports and performance bodywork. He also maintains a practice for elite athletes in professional football, baseball, and basketball. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Kirby. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Yes, that is an impressive resume for us to cover in the next couple hours.
Well, thank you. It took a lot of years to make all that happen.
It doesn't happen overnight, right?
Not at all.
So let's jump in. We like to start with our guest's background. Tell me, what got you initially interested in massage therapy? How did that come about?
I have to go back to childhood to talk about that because of my maternal grandmother. All 4 of my grandparents came from Greece in the early 1920s. My paternal grandparents settling in Tarpon Springs, Florida, and that grandfather, who I'm named after, helped start the sponge industry in Tarpon Springs. I don't know if you're aware that more sponges were brought in from the Gulf of Mexico after the 1900s, when the Greeks from one little island in Greece, Kalymnos, came over and started using deep diving techniques that were unknown to America at that time. My other grandparents moved to Miami, Florida, and my grandfather, who had been trained in how to operate coffee shops and little restaurants back in his home island of Andros, opened up first a coffee shop, which became the only 24-hour diner in Miami and was in the center of Miami for 47 years. But my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was a healer. She had been trained as a young woman, 12, 13, 14 years old, how to do the forms of folk medical healing that were common among Greeks, among Mesopotamians, the Persians, the Egyptians. All of them shared this body of knowledge. So she did massage therapy. She used herbology. She did forms of hydrotherapy. She even did cupping. As a kid, I didn't know that cupping was Chinese because it had a Greek name. So I always thought that was something that Hippocrates probably started.
Yeah.
But she also did spiritual healing, the removal of the evil eye, so to speak. So when I was a child living next door to my grandmother, we'd be playing in the yard and often see older Greek people come to her home, barely able to make it up the 3 steps to her front door, and an hour and a half, 2 hours later, come out looking like they could dance the Greek dances. So we knew she was doing something helpful, but it wasn't until perhaps I was 4, 5, 6 years old when issues that I had, whether it was abdominal issues or falls or sprains, anything. By the way, I had 13 cousins. We all lived within 2 blocks of each other. So all of the cousins would come to our Greek yaya, our grandmother, for her healing. So from the time we were children, we trusted her more than we trusted anybody else in medicine. That was the beginning of it. It wasn't until I got to Harvard, was playing football for Harvard, that I had the first athletic trainer work on an issue I was having in my freshman year with my hip rotators. I remember that was the first person that ever really dug in deeply and made me more aware of the size of my hip capsule. But it wasn't really until several years later in graduate school at Florida State, while playing rugby, that I had a very serious cervical injury and concussion at the same time. I went up for a ball. Somebody much stronger, much fitter, much more athletic got the ball, and his frontal bone hit my temporal bone. I was knocked out before I hit the ground. Several minutes later, I woke up on the sideline. And several minutes after that, the coach says, "Are you ready to go back in?" Again, this is 1975. We knew very little about concussion protocols at that time. I had been playing football since I was 12 years old. So concussions were something that we used to joke about. And so I didn't think anything of it. I went and played the game, and I woke up the next morning still in my uniform with no memory that I had played the game.
Oh, wow.
The day after that, the Monday after that, I started having some neurological pain from my neck down to my left arm and a headache unlike any headache that I had ever experienced before. Went to the athletic trainer at Florida State who worked with the football team, told him what had happened in the rugby game. And just by coincidence, the orthopedic surgeon that worked with FSU in 1975 walked into his office, and the athletic trainer, a wonderful man named Don Falls, who the sports medicine department at FSU is now named after. He's Hall of Fame athletic trainer. And we called him Doc Falls. But Doc said to the orthopedic surgeon, he had a neck injury. What should we do about it? The fellow asked me a couple of questions, and with no examination, of course, this is pre-MRIs, pre-CAT scans, none of that existed at the time, said, "It's not a problem. We'll schedule you for exploratory surgery next week." Luckily, Doc, when that guy left, pulled me aside and said, "George, I'm not going to let them operate on you. Let's do some old-fashioned manual therapy." So he was the first, I would say, official person to give me some treatment for my neck. And then he referred me to a young massage therapist who had just been trained in Tallahassee. I went to her several times, and she introduced me to a yoga teacher. All of that led to me receiving massage regularly, practicing yoga in a way that I never would have believed even a month or two earlier. And it was my yoga teacher who brought me an article about Rolfing. It was in the 1972 Psychology Today. There was a whole issue dedicated to body-oriented psychotherapy. So the work of Wilhelm Reich, of Alexander Lowen, and of Ida Rolf, and a few others were talked about in this one edition of Psychology Today. But he thought that I needed to get Rolf because of how slowly my flexibility was starting to emerge. He thought we needed to speed the process up. At that time, there were very few Rolfers in Florida. The best known man, Bill Williams, in Miami, that was an 8-hour drive away. I'd heard about him, but he told me about one of his top students that he had helped train, who was up in Atlanta, only 4.5 hours away. So I made the appointment, drove to Atlanta, I think 3 times in all for my first 3 sessions, and then convinced this Rolfer to come to Tallahassee and meet my fellow rugby mates, other people that I had been working with in drug rehab work. I had worked in Tallahassee for 3 years as a substance abuse counselor, and I was a research associate in the School of Criminology while I was doing graduate work at FSU. So I had people in the academic world, the athletic world, and the substance abuse world to come to the first ever in Tallahassee lecture and demo on Rolfing. It was a big hit. Many people signed up. So the rest of my sessions I received in Tallahassee. And it was during that time that He both gave me Ida Rolf's new book that had just come out that year. He actually had gone to Boulder for some meeting he was going to and brought back several signed copies. Devoured that book, even without understanding anatomy. I just dove into her book, and then the same athletic trainer, when I told him what I was interested in doing, said, take a course in anatomy here at Florida State. There's a cadaver dissection course that the graduate students are allowed to take in the School of Nursing. That was my first attempt to begin the understanding of anatomy. In doing all of that, I knew that I had to get licensed as a massage therapist. And up until either a couple of years before I started looking, there were only two schools, and one was in Gainesville. Benny Vaughn talked about that during his podcast. He had bought the school that he went to, the American Institute of Massage Therapy. The other was down in Miami and was part of the Dade County Public School Board. It was a vocational technical school in Miami. So going to Gainesville became my option. I would work all day, and at 4 o'clock, I would leave and drive the 2.5 hours to Gainesville and be in class 4 nights a week. And then once a month, we had weekends also. So I did that for 9 months. Back then, it was 1,000 hours, 500 hours of classroom, 500 hours of student massage that had to be documented. So it took me 9 months to complete the program. And towards the end of it, Bill Williams, who I mentioned earlier, who was one of the leading Rolfers in the country at that time. He had taught with Ida for many years, both at Esalen and in Boulder. When he moved to Florida, he was the first Rolfer east of the Mississippi River. And many of the Rolfers, the early Rolfers in the 70s who came from Florida, were his clients. He announced that he was opening up the Rolf Institute of Florida in Gainesville in the fall of '78. I was getting done with my work with Benny right about the same time. And I think I graduated from Benny School on a Friday night and started classes at SOMA on a Monday.
Wow.
That was a 6-month program at that time. And during that time, one other of the 12 students and I were tapped by Bill Williams to organize a 2-day workshop that would be an introductory workshop in structural integration for massage therapists in Florida. We later named that Somassage. So we used the SOMA name, same as the name of your organization. You know the Greek word, what it means, right?
Yes, of course, body.
It means the body. But soma in ancient Greece meant more than the body. It meant the totality of being, mind, spirit, soul, energy. All the energetic uses of the term soma were more alive in the ancient word. And my Greek grandmother knew the ancient Greek even better than the modern Greek. And I remember she used to say, "Πώς είναι το σώμα σου?" How is your, not just body, but how is your being? And soma to her meant something much bigger. So I studied soma. Luckily, the next year, Bill allowed me to come back and be an assistant instructor. I later found out that the same thing had happened to him with Ida Rolf. He was not in her first class at Esalen. He was the model in her first class. So she would show the work on Bill's body. The next year, he started training. The year after that, he was her assistant. When he asked Ida Rolf, "Why did you make me your assistant?" she said, "Because you needed one more year of training." So I think the same thing probably happened for me. Bill probably thought, I need to have this young man under my wing for at least another year. But he encouraged me to start practices both in Florida. I had an opportunity to start a practice in New York City, and then through a psychiatrist that I met from Germany who had come to Tallahassee because his wife was doing some postdoctoral work in physics. I worked on him, and he invited me to come to Munich the next year and start doing some practice at his, what he was calling a holistic health center. He had probably the first combined psychological, massage therapy, acupuncture, yoga, meditation center, both in Stuttgart and in Munich. I did not go there right away. What encouraged me to go within 6 months after I got out of school was he was teaching a retreat for other psychologists and psychiatrists on the island of Santorini in May of 1980. He invited me to come, knowing it was a Greek island that I had never explored before. I took his took his invitation and spent my first month in Europe in Santorini in May of 1980. And we repeated that 2 more times, May in 81, May in 82. So for those 3 years, I spent 3 months in Santorini, where I developed a both love story and fascination of this incredible island and its rich history, only to find 20 years later with my wife that we created in 2003 a retreat to take massage therapists to Santorini for a week-long retreat where we'd have education every morning for 4 hours, and we'd explore the island. We'd learn the history. I would introduce them to both an ancient and modern Greek lifestyle. And we did that for 12 years and brought many people there. And it really satisfied that immediate love that I had from my early days going to Santorini. So during the next 3 years, during those 80, 81, 82, I was spending 6 weeks in Germany, 6 weeks in New York City, and then 2 to 3 weeks in Florida, and repeating that 13 times during almost 3 years. So that was the first beginnings, and still not teaching a lot except to assist Bill, starting to teach a little bit of workshops. And it wasn't until 1985 that Bill allowed me to teach my own work through the Somassage program all over the country, and then Austria, Germany, Greece, and Spain.
Wow. Tell me, let's back up just a little bit. First of all, I want to know, can you teach me the Greek word for cupping?
Oh, Venzoudes.
Venzoudas.
V-E-N, Venzoudes. And so by the way, my first CE workshop that I ever went to after I got licensed, probably a year later, was here in St. Petersburg. I'm now living in the Tampa Bay area, and St. Petersburg had the first school of Chinese medicine, and I think it was the Florida Traditional College of Chinese Medicine. Perhaps the name's a little different than that, but it was the first place in Florida you could legally study acupuncture. Okay. And there was a workshop for massage therapists who were interested in learning about Chinese medicine and perhaps learning techniques that were legal for massage therapists to use. And of course, he brought up cupping. And I raised my hand. I said, but that's a Greek technique. How did the Chinese get it? He says, no, you have it the wrong way. The Chinese gave it to the Greeks. So he talked about the Silk Route, of course, from China through India, Mesopotamia, Persia, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and eventually Rome. And so I always thought Hippocrates had to be the father of all of this. Perhaps he had a Chinese teacher also.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And cultural influences are definitely something that we like to explore here at the Society.
And I've met so many people whose families had somebody, usually an aunt, a grandmother, somebody who was the healer of the family. Greek families, that's very common, especially in older times. And they didn't have doctors everywhere, especially on some of these remote islands. So it was the mothers and grandmothers that had to make sure that everybody was well. My grandmother had the herb garden in the backyard. She knew exactly what herbs to use for what kind of conditions. My grandmother had herbs growing in her garden that would calm the mind. And I can't tell you the different ones, but I knew she had different herbs for different issues. She even had an herb that could work on issues like colitis. But I had upset stomachs when I was a kid, and she knew how to get rid of it in my body in 5 minutes by burning cloves and letting them drop into water, and then having me drink this clove infused water, sipping it 3 times, and then using her fingers to go into the water and draw the sign of the cross on my forehead, on my chin, on my cheeks, and then splash it on the 4 corners of the body: head, lower torso, left arm, right arm. And within 5 minutes, I was cured.
Wow.
And 20 years later, I'm a massage therapist reading a book on American herbs, and I'm reading about cloves. And there's some active agent in cloves that's only released when it's heated. She knew to heat the clove. I don't know if she knew about the active agent, about the molecule that when it's heated, it's the best known natural cure for ulcers in your esophageal and stomach lining.
Wow.
I didn't know that. My grandmother knew that it worked on things like that. She didn't know the science of it, But I think back there, here's just so much in nature that we can learn from. And I know our studies in the Amazon are bringing more and more of that out, as it did in earlier generations in Africa, the types of plants and herbs and roots that are medicinal. And I think it's important. Massage therapists used to be a part of their knowledge, was the purveyor of that information. It was something that, you know, I wish I could have studied with her more. She was the introduction. And it wasn't until I started teaching in Greece that I realized how old her work was. So it was something that I think many cultures share, especially in the Mediterranean.
Yeah. Gotcha. I love that. George, let's back up just a minute. I don't want this to pass us by. I don't know many massage therapists that at some point in their lives also attended an Ivy League school. You attended Harvard. Talk to me if that experience is connected anyway into your life as a massage therapist.
It certainly is. It really has to be. When I first got to Harvard as a 18-year-old freshman, I was really still at a loss for what I might major in. I was thinking about dentistry at one point because we had a dentist in Miami, also Greek American, who all of us loved, all of us admired. He was the one that we looked up to. I was thinking about business because there were some businessmen that I knew in Miami that were encouraging me to move in the direction of economics and eventually the Harvard Business School. And so I was going to an economics lecture that I believed was being taught in a certain lecture hall. It was the second semester of my freshman year. I walked in, I sat down, I opened my notebook to take notes. Little did I know I was in the wrong lecture hall. I was listening to Erik Erikson, one of the greatest psychotherapists of the 20th century, who had been a student of Anna Freud, one of the few Harvard faculty members who had not gone to college and gotten a doctorate, but his studies with Anna Freud in Germany were enough for him to be accepted as one of the leading psychotherapists in the country. And his famous work was about the 6 developmental stages of childhood. And the lecture he was given was an introduction to a course that he was teaching on child psychology. By the end of that hour, I believe that man knew everything about my life more than I did, based upon the theories that he was teaching, and decided this is what I want to study. So I started taking courses both in clinical psychology. Actually, early on, you're not allowed to take the courses in clinical psychology. It starts with general psychology. I sort of moved towards social psychology and social anthropology. That was an area that I was more interested in, doing community work. And I became involved with an organization at Harvard that did a lot of community outreach. I was working in youth centers in different neighborhoods. Some of them were prototypical Portuguese neighborhoods. I remember the first time I worked in a youth center, I had to start learning some of their language right away because all of these kids were mainly speaking Portuguese. But I also worked at the East End, which was more of an African-American neighborhood. And we were moving around the Boston area and the Cambridge area and trying to have as positive an influence as we could have. And it was towards the end of my studies as an undergraduate at Harvard that Erik Erikson made the decision to retire and announced his final lecture. And graduate students of his, 20, 30, 40 years apart from when they studied with him, all came to Cambridge to hear his last lecture. I was in the audience. We were amazed at what he was talking about. His overview of the field of psychology at that time was enormous. By the way, I don't want to say his competitor, but the other big name in the psychology department at that time was B.F. Skinner. So you had Skinnerian psychotherapy and you had Freudian psychotherapy. And I one day was lucky enough to be in an elevator where first Erikson came on board and then Skinner came on board. I'm the only other person. And I'm thinking, what words of wisdom are going to come out of these giants? And it ended up being a discussion of how bad the weather was that day.
Oh.
But in that last lecture, the question and answer period at the end sort of brought out some of the highlights of his career. And the final question was, Dr. Erikson, what do you think the future of psychology is? And his answer, without explanation, he immediately walked off the stage. was the future of psychology is a better understanding of human physiology.
Hmm.
And it struck all of us. It struck me. I had not studied any anatomy or physiology while I was at Harvard. I had had only 6 weeks in 10th grade biology back in high school. And I was upset that if this is so important, why wasn't it a part of my education while I was there? And it wasn't until I got to Florida State and began some graduate studies and then had the injury that I began my study in anatomy and in physiology. Remembering that lecture from 3 years earlier, I was upset that my whole training from the time of kindergarten through graduate school, other than 6 weeks in, again, 10th grade biology, had completely avoided the study of the human body. I knew more about the geography of the earth than of my own body.
Wow. That's profound, right?
But that gave me a basis to go to Benny Vaughn and say, Benny, I need to get through your program. I've got all my grades. Back then, you weren't allowed to bring courses from the university to a massage school. That changed by the 1990s. But back then, I wanted Benny to say, I'll accept this documentation that you studied. And he sort of did that, but also said, yeah, but you're going to have to take every quiz and every test that I give everybody else to make sure that you still have a handle on that information. So it was really, again, because of the injury, doing yoga, getting raw, studying anatomy and physiology, and then making the commitment. And I will be honest that when I was first learning massage therapy, it was pre-Benny Vaughn. And if you don't mind for a moment, about a half year after the injury, and I'm already doing yoga a lot, I know that I'm moving in the direction of one day studying to be a structural integration practitioner. I was already taking anatomy and physiology. I met a young man who had just come to Tallahassee named Farah Allen. And Farah Allen came with his wife and his 2-year-old son. They were traveling the country in a VW van with a sign on the side that said Omlistic Massage with the Om symbol on the side of the van. Somehow we met. He told me he was teaching a 2-day workshop and would I be interested in coming. We arranged all of that. And at that workshop, Farah Allen and myself and Rick Rosen, a fellow who later opened up the Body Therapy Institute in North Carolina, were studying massage at that point. All of us unlicensed, absolutely under-trained, but thinking that we were the future of massage therapy from this weekend workshop. And out of that workshop, you had the Atlanta School of Massage, the Body Therapy Institute in North Carolina, and then the Core Institute in Tallahassee emerge 10 to 12 years later. So it was that was my first education in massage therapy was with Farah, and then I met Benny a couple of months after that and started the training immediately.
Gotcha. And what year was that you started the school started attending the school at Benny's?
Benny's was in the beginning of '78. I probably January of '78. We finished in October of '78, and the SOMA Institute opened up in October of '78.
Gotcha.
Now, the SOMA Institute was supposed to be, we had enrolled, applied, sent our money in to the Rolf Institute, because at that time, the Rolf Institute had announced it was opening up 3 new branches, one in Florida, one in New York City, and one in California. Mm. Ida Rolf was very ill that year, and her son, who was a Rolfer in Philadelphia, came back to Boulder to help run the Institute while his mother was really in the final stages of the illness that took her life at, I think, in January or February of '79. And he made the decision not to allow those branches to open. Wow. Bill Williams decided made the commitment. He had gotten the building space. He had moved his family to Gainesville. He went ahead and just simply changed the name to the SOMA Institute of Neuromuscular Integration. And as we walked in that day, thinking we were attending the Rolf Institute, we were greeted by a letter from the Rolf Institute that said that because the Rolf Institute has rescinded opening of these branches, if we made the decision to stay and study with Bill Williams, we may never use the name Rolfer or Rolfing in the discussion of our work as far as who we are.
Wow.
I was heartbroken. That was one of the things I really wanted to do. But I also knew that if Ida Rolfe wasn't teaching anymore, the person I wanted to learn from was Bill Williams. And so I stayed involved with that institute for 11 years. Eventually, as you may know, the SOMA Institute moved out to Washington State and existed there under Marcia Nolte and Karen Boleski. Marcia Nolte was one of my first clients after I graduated school. She was a ballet dancer who was teaching ballet in Tampa. I ended up working on her and a couple of the other teachers from that classical ballet center. And she decided at the end of the work, at the end of the 10 sessions, that she was going to become a massage therapist and learn the 10 sessions of structural integration. Made an incredible career, still practicing. And so she ended up with the SOMA Institute out in Washington State, probably 10 or 11 years after I went to school there. It was about the same time that I made the decision with my wife to open up the Core Institute in Tallahassee. And we can talk about that whenever you're ready.
All right, sure. Let's see. So you also mentioned earlier that you were able to start a practice in New York. Do you mean that you worked as a practitioner in New York? Did you get a license in New York?
I mean, I worked underground in New York.
Okay.
I was not afraid to be underground. As a matter of fact, when I first learned those basic massage techniques from Farrah Allen, I began working on all my rugby buddies. I began working on friends I had done drug rehab work with. Other friends, my girlfriend at the time and I had opened up a natural foods juice bar. So I had lots of customers that were interested. So I was doing a lot of work pre-licensure. And it was two massage therapists who came to me and said, George, we understand that you love doing this, but we're going to turn you into the board of massage therapy if you don't go get a license.
Uh-oh.
So that's what gave me the shove in the right direction. Up until that point, I was more than happy to work underground and not worry government controlling massage. I hated the idea. I was much more of a libertarian then, perhaps, than I am now, only to later on become a member of the massage board. But back then it was, I don't need to do that. Yeah, how are they going to catch me? Who's going to tell on me? And one of the young ladies, initially, of the three ballet teachers in Tampa that I worked with, one of them ended up moving to New York and getting involved with the ballet troupe up there. She called me and said, George, I've showed my before and after pictures to the directors of the ballet company that I'm with. They want you to come up and work on them. So it was I saw it as a private enterprise between me and this husband and wife who were two of the top ballet people in New York at that time. Little did I know that would explode, that I would start working on ballet dancers, not just in their a dance company, but also many others that knew of them. And I was starting to go up to New York before I ever got licensed as a massage therapist in Florida. So that would have been 1977 through 1978 while I was still in school. So when I finally got licensed here in Florida and I went to New York to start doing more work, I looked into the licensure. Back then, it was very difficult to get licensed in New York unless you went to school in New York. Okay. They did have more hours, classroom hours in Florida. I wasn't worried about that, but they would not accept any of the credits I had earned at Benny School.
Dang.
By the way, Benny School changed during the year I was there from the American Institute of Massage Therapy to the first edification of the Florida School of Massage, which is still in Gainesville. Excellent school. I thought, of course, they're going to accept all of the documentation I have. They accepted none of it. They didn't accept my licensure from Florida. So like I did when I was younger, I went underground and says, well, if nobody tells on me, I'm not going to say anything, and worked there for 2.5 years. Even in the final year, I was working with a well-known chiropractor who had contracts with many artists, including ballet, symphony, opera, Broadway, studio musicians, famous artists from Roberta Flack, even the visual artists like Andy Warhol was one of her patients, John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Roberta Flack became my favorite. I loved working with her more than any other artist I've ever worked with. And she said, George, as long as you're working under me, you don't have to get licensed. I never looked into it. I didn't want to know what the real answer was, but I accepted it. And I worked with her for a year and a half. The final year and a half, I was living and working in New York City.
Wow. I'm going to take a point of personal privilege here because Andy Warhol was mentioned. I've just got to
Yes.
share with you that I have a tattoo of
Oh,
Andy
you do. You
Warhol.
do.
I love me some Warhol.
And so, because of history is important, the chiropractor is Linda Lee, Li,
Okay.
Chinese American. She was a nutritionist, I believe, before she became a chiropractor. If I have that wrong, I'm sorry, Linda. But she practiced both branches of nutrition and chiropractic. She had movement therapy in her clinic. She had colonic therapy, which that was the first time I'd heard of colonics in New York, although in Florida, as a massage therapist in those years, you had to study colonic therapy. So I was
Really?
familiar with that. And Marcia Nolte, who I mentioned earlier, who was one of my first clients who got involved, she introduced me to Linda Lee. She was working for her a year after she got out of the SOMA Institute, and then meeting somebody that she wanted to move away from New York City with, I believe up to Maine. She called me as I was coming back from Germany on one of my trips and said, George, there's going to be an opening here. You have to take it. So Linda Lee was not only Andy Warhol's doctor, he refused to go to traditional medical doctors. He
Yeah.
died of sepsis. And from the stories I remember hearing, Dr. Lee, through his illness, told him over and over again that he needed traditional medical therapy. He needed more testing done. He needed antibiotics. He needed all of these things. He refused all of us. And after his death, unfortunately, Linda Lee was investigated because of the premature death of Andy Warhol. Of course, she was cleared, but it was a very difficult time for her. And that was right around when I met her. But she introduced me to so many other wonderful people. Even my favorite restaurant owner in New York, you've heard of Sardi's Restaurant, which is in the Broadway area. It's across the street from the Schubert Theater. It's been in many movies. It's the restaurant bar that everybody in Broadway goes to after the shows, especially the directors, the producers, the actors. And Vincent Sardi became one of my patients. And from him, I learned more about the history of New York, especially that he was one of the few that had horses in Central Park.
Oh,
I
wow.
didn't know there was a stables in Central Park, and only a small number of the very wealthy could have their horses there. And when I met him, not a month later, he came in, not at the time of his session, but early in the morning, soaking wet, and it was freezing outside. And he had rescued two boys that had fallen into a pond in Central Park. He was riding his horse when he saw this accident happen, and he came to their rescue. And then, because we were a block away from the park, immediately on his horse came over to us to get warmed up. I think my job was to go down to the liquor store and buy a bottle of brandy so he could drink some brandy to help warm him up. But we took care of him so well. And then I started being his therapist every other week on Wednesdays. And he introduced me to a world in Broadway that I never knew about. Everybody gave Vincent Sardi tickets to their new shows, too many for him to go to. So the fellow that took care of his horse, the fellow that gave him a haircut, and now myself, were inheriting many of these tickets. So I got a tip almost every time that he came to see me, 2 tickets to whatever was the best show in town.
Wow.
And then I started meeting Broadway folks, and my client base expanded from ballet and symphony and opera to Broadway.
Did you ever get a New York license, or did you
No,
just work
never.
actually?
Never. And I was there for at least 3 years. I got when my wife and I decided to marry, I met my wife in Florida, but she was from Brooklyn. And
Oh,
she was a New York girl, but she had moved to Florida. And I told her when we were getting ready to get married, I said, listen, I've got this great job in New York City. Come back to New York. We'll live there. We'll be on the Upper West Side. Absolutely refused. I said, well, I've got this great job in Munich, Germany. You'll love it there. Absolutely refused. So, of course, because of the love I certainly had for her at that time, this was 1982 when we married. I stayed in Tallahassee, but still was traveling a lot, especially to Germany, sometimes to New York. But my Germany connections lasted through the rest of the 80s. I kept going back there to teach.
gotcha. Before we get too far into your actual practice as a massage therapist, I want to just go back to your entry level education.
Okay.
Did Benny have other instructors that were providing you with your education?
Jerry Eckert was both the instructor in anatomy and physiology and the co-owner with Benny. I believe he talked about that in his broadcast, that that the two of them opened the school, ran the school. Benny was more affiliated with the former owner. He had been his student. I'm not sure how he met Jerry. I think he spoke about that during his podcast. But the two of them were the only instructors there. The class I was in had probably 15 students, only 2 men and 13 women. Um, and again, it was the final year, I think, that he had the school as the American Institute of Massage Therapy. I believe one of the names I have on a diploma says American Institute of Natural Health. So I'm not sure if that was a part of the school or perhaps one of the names he was using at that time. But it wasn't until I graduated and the school became the Florida School of Massage that I began to meet other people who were beginning to start schools. One in Miami, Iris Berman, who started Educating Hands, Dan and Tekla Ulrich in Tampa Bay, who started the Suncoast School. And in Tallahassee, while we did not have a school initially, one of the leading massage therapists was a man named Alvin Drake. Al was a therapist for 60 years. So when I think about my 47 years or Benny's 50 years, I think, oh, Al Drake did this day in and day out for 60 years. And 30 years into his career, he lost his eyesight.
Oh,
So
wow.
for the final 30 years, he was blind, and he was a member of the Florida Board of Massage, which means writing all the rules and regulations that the statutory authority of the legislature would let a board write.
Wow.
And I remember as I met him, he was studying over in Braille these books, these memoranda books of what the next meeting was going to be like. And I thought, how many hours does he spend on this just to prepare for one of 4 meetings every year? Um, Not too long after I met him, he decided to open up a small night program, an evening program in Tallahassee. And with the help of the Ulriches, Dan and Tekla from Tampa, opened up a school in Tallahassee called the North Florida School of Massage Therapy. I became a member of the faculty at that point, or I started teaching some of the Somassage work there. And then he allowed me to start teaching the part of the course that nobody cared about at that time. That was the history of massage. So,
Oh,
so my studies really were some books that Al gave me and said, read these and teach as much as you can from these books. So I will be honest to say that some of the history that I taught was probably made up in my mind's eye of what should be the history of massage therapy rather than what actually was. But Al really encouraged me to get more involved in teaching. And when he decided to retire, he offered me his school. And that's when my wife and I, at the end of 1989, decided to go ahead and purchase the school and change it, become a full-time school, a day and evening program, and we renamed it, of course. But the one thing that I remember him saying at the time that we bought the school is the only thing I'm going to ask, other than the arrangement we have immediately, is when my son gets out of the Navy, and if he decides to become a massage therapist, please give him a scholarship.
hmm.
And so we did that. Many years later, his son came back to Tallahassee, and Roger Drake became one of our top students. And all of these people through our 25 years at the school became part of a really wonderful family in Tallahassee. And Roger followed in his dad's footsteps.
Wow. That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that story about Al. Yeah, so tell me, as you were coming out of massage therapy school, were there any, of course, it's Florida,
Right.
tons of big names going on in Florida as the time that you're coming up. Who really, besides Benny Vaughn, did you really try to follow, try to learn from, that
Well,
you're really following?
because Benny Vaughn was my initial instructor for what I considered entry level massage, I immediately jumped to a 6-month program of, I thought, the most advanced work being taught in the world at that moment. So for me, structural integration was my only study that I had for the next well, even though 6 months there at the Institute, the next 3 years I focused solely on consuming as much information about structural integration and the practice of it, practicing as many sessions as I could. My goal always was to do 1,000 sessions a year in structural integration. And I was told that's too many. You're going to overwork your body. You'll never last more than 5 years. And yet Bill Williams' training, and I believe training of any excellent therapist in any modality, has to include an understanding of body mechanics at the highest level. And so Bill Williams, I believe, was one of the better trainers in body mechanics. He was a very lean man himself. He was 6'3", 140 pounds. Ida Rolf told him when she first met him that he would never be a Rolfer because he was too lean. He didn't have the muscular or the solid body that was needed, the more mesomorphic body that was needed to do her work. Wow. When he finally learned her work, not only was he accepted by Ida as a quality therapist, but he became Ida Rolf's therapist. And she liked his style and actually helped term it soft Rolfing. He had a more comfortable style of Rolfing in the old ages, and that soft Rolfing style became SOMA. And yet the soft Rolfing was a mirage. It's soft initially. It opens the body slowly, but once there are layer upon layer upon layer of fascial and muscular membranes released, then he goes into the intrinsic work. So we're not in a hurry to get deep, but we certainly get deep and perhaps are as effective with our intrinsic work as much as anybody has been. So learning from Bill Williams was a priority. Even after I finished my formal training, I knew being around him, hearing him teach. I remember the first time I saw him teach the first week of the course, which was 1 year after I did it. I went up to him at the end of the week. I said, Bill, all this new stuff that you've added is remarkable. And his response was, George, I haven't added anything. These are exactly the same concepts and theories and even the history part that you learned last year. You're just hearing it with a more open mind. You're hearing it for the second time, and more of it is settling in. So I knew that being around him. But the first workshop that I ever saw, and I was really impressed, was at an FSMTA convention, perhaps 2 years after I got out of school. This is prior to before continuing education was mandatory. It was not yet mandatory in 79, 80, 81. That didn't happen until 1986 that it became mandatory in Florida. But it was Paul St. John teaching his version of neuromuscular therapy. Fascinated, loved his approach, loved how he handled himself on stage. And I thought to myself, one day I'm going to teach at this FSMTA convention because of the influence that he had on me at that point. And, Benny Vaughn was a leader in the field already at that time, even though he was only 3 years my senior in being a therapist. He already was, the sports massage guy, at least in Florida. Bob King, I met him a couple of years later. He would have been another big influence on me. And later on, I found out, 10 years later, when Bob and I were doing some work together on national certification, that we share the same birthday. So wow. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm loving all of this that you're saying, by the way, George, about really going into depth about Somassage and structural integration. I want to ask you, though, when you got licensed, initially, those first few years, did you have much interaction or much awareness of the Florida Board of Massage at the time?
I didn't even know it existed until I met Al Drake, and he was on the board.
Okay.
And so he told me about the board. The board has, the state of Florida has a regulation that you can only serve 2 4-year terms. He had already been on the board 17 years when I met him. So I asked him one day, I said, Al, how is it that you're still on the board when it says here in the laws only 2 4-year terms? He says, at the end of every one of my terms, the governor would take me off the board days before the end of my term, and a month later would put me on the new board. And this was done several times. And then I found out that because he was not only an excellent massage, but by the way, he was trained in Ohio, one of the earliest states to have licensure. I believe they got licensed in 1915. He was probably licensed in, I met him in the middle 70s to late 70s. He had already been licensed for 45 years at that time. So he was probably licensed somewhere in the 1920s. you
Wow.
know. But he said, George, all the governors of the state since I've been a massage therapist here, and many of the Supreme Court justices and the leaders of the Senate and the House and all their wives come to me. I'm the massage therapist for the government of the state of Florida in Tallahassee. He
Imagine.
says, so they have respected me and honored me and given me grace on this being on the board all these years. And it really was, I guess my evolution under his school for a couple of years allowed him to see the position that, yeah, maybe if I retire, I can mention to the governor to put George on the board. So that happened. When he retired from the board, I was put into his seat. At that moment, I was the youngest massage therapist ever to sit on the board, probably the least qualified massage therapist ever to be named to a massage board.
Wow. So when did that happen?
1986.
86. All right. And I assume you just served those 2 4-year terms.
Till 1994. I served for 8 years. The last 4 years, I was the vice chair. But at my first meeting, again, not knowing anything about how boards operate, they didn't even have time to give me an orientation, which most new board members have. At the end of the meeting, the chair of the board at that time, a man named Tony Baselli, wonderful, wonderful man, said, George, we're really impressed that you're our new member. We like how you've handled yourself. We'd like to know if you would accept the honor, use the word honor, of being our first chair of continuing education. Those laws had just been written 1 or 2 years earlier. They were coming into effect. Now the board has to look at the law and write rules of how continuing education is going to operate so the staff can handle applications for who's going to be a presenter, what are the documented hours, how do you do sign-in, all these different microscopic things of how to run continuing education programs, and then apply it to your next license. All that had to be done. Little did I know that the board, for the last 2 or 3 meetings amongst themselves, had been arguing nobody wanted to be the chair of CEs. So I was like that fish that got hooked and thought it was a wonderful thing, again, an honor that they were giving me. But continuing education became my bailiwick at that point. And it was one of the reasons why in the late 80s, when I'm still on the board, when the American Massage Therapy Association decided to start the National Certification Project, people like myself from various state boards, we had Stephen Schenkman from New York, Susan Rosen and Suzanne Carlson from Washington State and Oregon, myself, and there were at least 4 of the 9 people who were board members, but I was the only one who has sort of organized continuing ed. And so that was one of the roles that I played in national certification, was to be the continuing ed guy, or at least to sort of lead the development of that standard.
Interesting. I like this thread that you're weaving of how all these different aspects of your career kind of lead into one another. But I'm wondering, so the time that you were serving on the Florida Board of Massage is also the time that you're teaching full time, right? The core
did not open up till 1990. So for the first 4 years, I was a board member, and I'm teaching workshops most of the time on weekends around the state of Florida, some in the country, some in Germany. 1988, I spent the summer in Germany teaching the first structural integration class there. So I was still teaching, still having a practice. I had an office in Tallahassee. I was no longer working elsewhere in terms of body work. I wasn't doing it in New York or in Munich, but I kept up all those contacts I had made and taught as many workshops as I could. We started the school in 1990. And the year before that, I was teaching in the Canary Islands, an island called Lanzarote. And there was a German resort there that was built very much on the model of Esalen.
Okay.
Yeah, it was called, now I'm going to have to remember the name of the resort. I met the founder of it in Germany. He told me about his resort and said, I'd like you to come and spend some time with us in 1989, do some teaching. And if you like it, we'd like to invite you back every year. to lead some classes. And they were doing that with many people throughout Europe. They bring in instructors in acupressure or in what was called zone therapy. In Europe, reflexology is called zone therapy. I remember meeting numerous people at Lanzarote, in Lanzarote from all over Europe. I even met a woman from Spain who was doing some remarkable work with movement and exercise that I thought added a lot to the massage field. And when my wife and I went there the first time in '89, on one of the days by the way, the Canary Islands, for people who don't know, are about 25 miles off the coast of Northwest Africa. You're very close to the Africa coast. It's controlled by Spain, but you're closer to Africa than you are anywhere else. Okay. One day we woke up and there was a warning put out by the administration of the resort: do not go outside today. We're having a sandstorm. So this was a sandstorm coming across the Atlantic Ocean from the Sahara Desert.
Wow.
It said, we are organizing a trip to a very special place on the island that is indoors, and we'll take you there, but your day will be spent in caves underneath Lanzarote. And it's called Jamios del Agua. These are caves at the northern part of the island. This is for some reason in my lifetime, I've been attracted to volcanic islands. And Lanzarote is a volcanic island that exploded about 300 years ago, and the lava covered 80% of the island for 6 years. Because of that, the people living on the island early on had to flee, had to evacuate, but their valuables from both their churches and their farm animals were taken to the series of caves where there was spring water. And a dozen men were left behind with the animals, with the valuables, to look over them. And every so many months, a boat would come over bringing supplies. Some of the men would exchange out. This went on for 6 years. So now these caves are a national shrine. And we spent this day in this series of caves, one being large enough that the Barcelona Symphony Orchestra recorded a symphony there, and it was playing when we walked into this cavern. And I couldn't believe this beautiful music that was created in this cave was playing. And they walked us to the edge of this cavern and said, look down. And down below was another cavern hundreds of feet below. And the fellow said, how far down do you think that is? And some of us guessed, 100 meters, 200 meters. He said, one of you pick up a rock. And my wife quickly picked up a rock, threw it to see how long it would take. And I'm looking over the edge down this gaping ravine. She throws the rock, and immediately water is splashing in my face.
Wow.
This is one of the world's most perfect reflection ponds. It was reflecting the ceiling above of the cavern that we were in. I was so shocked, not in a negative way, but I started laughing, and I fell back right on my gluteus maximus, right on the sandy, rocky floor, laughing that I was so completely baffled by this reflection pond. When I stood up and we started moving towards another part of the cave, I said to my wife, Al wants us to buy his school. If we do that, know that we're in the core of the earth right now. Let's call it the Core Institute. So the name of our school came from a cave in Lanzarote, which again is in the Canary Islands. By the way, Ida Rolf, of course, was one of the first people to talk about core versus sleeve. The sleeve were the extrinsic tissues, the core were all of the intrinsic tissues. So I had read about that in her book. And of course, studying with Bill, he used those terms also. But being in the core of the earth just struck me at the time as the most important aha moment that I had about branding ourselves.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's an awesome story, George. I don't want to make any assumptions, but is your wife also a licensed massage therapist?
She is not. She is not. When we opened the school, she became our financial director. Later, with the development of the internet, she did all of our work on the internet. She did payroll. She did everything. She was the person that students were happy to give money to in terms of tuition. She made life easy. She organized it so everybody who really wanted to be there could come there. During the years there, she also became an excellent photographer, and her life's work is really photography. She's been doing that now for over 25 years. And when I travel to teach or travel the world to do whatever I'm doing, she's always there documenting it. A little bit like Benny Vaughn and his wife, who's a wilderness photographer. Patty creates these videos from photography of all the events that we do, whether it's the retreats in Santorini or classes around the country. We've been to Australia many times teaching. From 2009 to 2012, I taught 9 times in the UK, getting people ready for the 2012 Olympics. We haven't talked Olympics yet, but that was something that she documented and really has become a vital part of who we are. I'm not a social media person. She takes care of all of that. But when I met her, she was on the first day of the first job she had as a cosmetologist. And that would have been back in 1979. And I needed a haircut and trim. I had a Greek afro. I had a big, long black beard, and I needed it cut down for an event that I was going to. And I knew somebody who was opening a salon. And she says, I've got this new girl, but you'll be her first customer. Do you trust me that I tell you that she's good? Yes. And so quickly I fell in love, and 2.5 years later, we got married.
Well, that's a sweet story. Does she still do cosmetology?
No. When we started the school in 1990, she gave all of that up just to help me run the school. I am not the person to handle books. I'm not the person to handle taxes or to handle anything like that. So without her, I could not have done it. And she knows that. But the last 5 years before we started the school, from 1985 to 1989, we finally combined our work together at an athletic club, and I was doing massage in one room and she was doing hair in the next room. So we had the early version, it wasn't called that yet, the early version of a day spa.
Yeah.
In the late 80s. And then again, 1990, in January, we started the school. 1 month later is when national certification was started. Just to let you know, our school started in January. The first meeting for national certification was in February. And I mentioned that they brought me there maybe because of my involvement with both the Board of Massage Therapy in Florida, but also I was one of the structural integration discipline people. They brought in people from sports massage. They brought in people from shiatsu. They brought in people from different forms of body work, different disciplines. But I was certain that I was there because of CEs. When I was using the restroom, I came back and they told me that while I was gone, they had a vote and I was the new chair of the certification council. So for the next 2.5 years, again, the beginning of our school, I'm working almost as many hours every week on national certification as I am on the school.
Wow. So talk to me about the NCB TMB, the Certification Council that you chaired. It seems like they're doing that quite a bit to you, giving you these jobs, whether it's the Florida board or the NCB. Talk to me about that, though.
Yeah, that was probably the most instrumental group I ever belonged to, where all of us were on a learning curve that went way beyond what massage school or massage disciplines could have ever prepared us for. I credit 2 people, and I think Benny may have mentioned this because he was one of those 9 people. He was definitely one of the leaders in sports massage. He was also a national officer of the AMTA. I was not an AMTA or FSMTA member. I didn't join organizations back then. I thought, I don't really need to be in a Swedish massage association. I'm doing structural integration. But when they invited me to come, it was Bob King was the president of the AMTA. Elliot Green, his first VP, was the person who really coordinated all the work that we needed to do to prepare for the project at hand. He had already gone to meetings of the National Organization of Competency Assurance, NOCA, and that's an important agency that approves the certification process for all medical boards. They had done it with physical therapy, done it with nursing. So we were the next group to come along and say, we want certification. We want it approved nationally. What are the steps we have to take? And Elliot was the one who studied that and helped Bob King realize the kind of people that we needed on that board to make it happen. They hired a consultant named Joan Knapp, K-N-A-P-P, a Princeton University graduate and her doctorate in psychometrics. Have you ever heard of that term before?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, the study of how to make exams, how to make them fair. So she came to us and spent that whole first weekend with us, and then worked with us for the next year on helping us organize our thinking about all the tasks that we had to do to make national certification happen. It still took 2.5 years. It wasn't until May of 1992 that we were able to present our first exam to, I think, about 10,000 massage therapists nationwide. I may be wrong on that number. It could have been less than that, but we were pretty impressed with the number of people who took a voluntary exam, an exam that didn't count towards any licensure anywhere. That wasn't in the cards yet, but a lot of people who really wanted to take it. And by the way, the first step in national certification is writing a job analysis survey, asking the profession, what do you believe are the knowledges, the skills, and the competencies of a person starting their first day of work as a massage therapist? Not as an advanced therapist, but getting out of school. If you're going to operate safely, we didn't even talk about licensure because there was only 7 or 8 states licensed at that time in 1990. So this job analysis survey was sent out again, perhaps 10,000 people nationwide, and we had one of the highest return rates, people responding to this survey. So we knew there was an interest out there for national certification. We also knew that there was an argument, and certainly in my younger days, I was one of those people who said, we don't need licensure. We don't need state boards. We don't need government to tell us what we can and can't do. And there was still a lot of those libertarian-oriented people in massage therapy. So during those 2.5 years of development, a lot of it was spent with Elliot Green and myself and a couple of others going to every national meeting, everything sponsored by massage therapy in any state, to inform them what we were doing. We had to write articles for all the journals. We did all of these things. And that's when I got to know Robert Calvert and Judy Calvert really well. Okay. And they had earlier just started the Massage magazine. I got involved with Robert on a project in 1990 that was the International, I'm trying to say this right, the International Symposium for Massage Therapy, a big international conference that we held, again, back on that island I told you about, Lanzarote. A year after I had gone there the first time, I organized bringing several hundred people from all over the world to study together and have the first international symposium on massage therapy and body work. And so Bob was on the other side. Bob was sort of anti-licensure, didn't want to see it happen. And there were some other people who I trusted. Have you heard the name David Palmer? Sure. The father of seated massage. Yeah. He came to California where there wasn't any licensure. He came to Florida to teach. We all loved David, and David hated licensure. He didn't want anybody to tell him what he could teach, who he could teach it to, and who could practice seated massage. In Florida, he had to respect that we had laws about that, but that was one of the few states that did. So people that I really admired were totally against this project that I was working on. So I had to hopefully begin to convince some of them and others, and even myself. I had to wonder, where is this all going to lead to? Well, where it's led to because of that exam and a few other occurrences, but the exam was the main thing. I think it's about 47 states now have licensure, but the majority of them came from the middle to late 90s to early 2000 is when the big renewal of licensure happened. Again, I didn't realize that I thought Florida was the oldest at starting its license in 1943. Ohio actually started in 1915. Yeah. And there was nothing in between those two states. You had one state from 1915 to 1943. It was the only place where you had to get licensed as a massage therapist.
Yeah. Now, if the actual exam itself was rolled out in May of 92, I also noticed that you got AMTA's President's Award in 1992, George. Are those two related to each other?
Yeah. That next fall was when I got it at the Philadelphia convention. I didn't know they were doing it. I still have it up behind me somewhere. It was my first President's Award. I was honored. And I knew that without AMTA, I wouldn't be standing there. I wasn't even a member of AMTA still at that point. It was a couple of years later that I became a member after I was divorced from national certification. But yes, it was an honor, and it was a moment in my life when I realized that when I started this, none of us were thinking about awards. We were wondering about, would there ever be a massage therapist who would voluntarily take this exam? And why would they take it if they're already practicing, if they don't need to take it? So it took us a while to understand the impact that that national exam was going to have on the profession. We knew we were contemplating, and we were using it as part of our public relations, that this is going to advance us towards being a professionally recognized discipline.
Right.
And I think is around that time, or perhaps a little bit later in the 90s, especially with Benny Vaughn's work with Olympics in 95 and 96, leading to the Atlanta Games. I was lucky at the same time to work with the British Olympic team training in Tallahassee for the Atlanta Olympics. Our entry and our acceptance into the sports medicine arm of Olympics and Paralympics, I think, had just as much influence on our both recognition and acceptance as a profession.
Well, now's as good a time as any, George. Let's talk about the Olympics and how you initially got started working there. Your first one would have been in 96,
It was Atlanta Games.
Okay.
In 1994, my 9-year-old daughter and I were in downtown Tallahassee at what's called Springtime Tallahassee, a big art, music, and food festival every spring in Tallahassee. Tallahassee is a beautiful southern city, not like people think of Florida as Miami or Orlando, even Tampa Bay. Tallahassee is more like Georgia, Louisiana. We have beautiful hills, we have springs, we have lakes, we have gators, more alligators hanging around the creeks and streams of Tallahassee. But springtime there is beautiful. The southern springtime starts in Tallahassee and then moves north. So at this festival, my daughter and I are walking along from one artist booth to the next, and she sees a table with a banner on it that has a lion. My daughter is a Leo, so the lion is the first thing that attracted her. But then it had the Olympic rings, and she was 9 years old, probably in third grade, going into fourth grade, and her elementary school started Olympics in the elementary school era, and each class would represent a certain country, and they'd have these fall games. And so we would go and support our daughter at her Olympics as a 7-year-old, 8-year-old. So she drugged me over to this table, said, "Daddy, a lion and Olympics." I had no idea what that table was. It wasn't an artist. It was a man working in Tallahassee as the director of AT&T in Tallahassee from England, who had been named the volunteer coordinator for the British Olympic team warm weather training camps that were going to start 1 year later at Florida State University. So Florida State hosted the British Olympic team in the summer of 95 and the summer of 96 to do all of their training. All 500 athletes, 200 or 300 coaches and staff members would live in Tallahassee during the summer and get used to our hot, humid weather that they were for sure going to experience in August in Atlanta. Yeah. We walked up to the table. He explained what he was doing there. I gave him my card. I said, "If your athletes or coaches need any help with massage therapy, please know that our school would be glad to help out." So we were a 4-year-old school at that point. We probably had no more than 100 students every year. But I thought my students would really learn a lot from working with Olympic athletes. 6 months later, we get a call from London that the British Olympic medical staff is coming over to meet with the hospital, with the physical therapy groups, with the sports medicine department at FSU, a couple of other medical organizers that were going to help these athletes. And they wanted to meet with me to talk about massage therapy. And in that first meeting, they said, "We'd be happy to have you help, but you can't use students. You have to recruit therapists who would have the same qualifications as therapists that we've experienced at World Games or at perhaps earlier Olympics." Wow. I didn't even know what those standards were. I called up Benny Vaughn in 94. I said, "Benny, I know you're doing something in Atlanta for the Atlanta Olympics. tell me what you're doing. He says, George, I was going to call you because I need a couple people to help me interview people for this team. I'd like you to help me out. So he started sharing his standard with me. I started writing that down and sending it back to London. Eventually, they accepted everything I said, and we brought in massage therapists, usually for 1 week. If they were there with us for 6 to 8 weeks, the team, we would bring therapists in each week, a new group of 25 therapists. I would train them for 6 hours a day during the 7 days they were there. They would work another 6 hours on the athletes, late afternoon into the early evening. But it was that group, many of them ended up becoming the massage therapists at the Atlanta Olympics. But we brought in therapists from all over the country, from Canada, from Ireland, from England, and from Australia. And we all had to be not only background checks from the FBI, but also from Scotland Yard. So I thought that was interesting that now I've been vetted by Scotland Yard. So we got all that approved. On the final day of the training camp, a day before the opening of the Olympics in '96, Princess Anne came to Tallahassee. You know who she is, right?
Yeah,
now the sister of the king.
Ah, gotcha.
And had been an equestrian Olympian for Great Britain. She had ridden in the Olympics before.
Okay.
So she was the Olympic representative of Britain to the International Olympic Committee. She was on the IOC committee, as high as you can get in Olympic standards, right? She comes to thank everybody, and they host this luncheon for her. And I'm sitting at the medical table with all these other doctors, head of the hospital, physical therapy, whoever it was. And we would as she came to our table, we'd stand up, turn around. We had our name badges, and she'd go around, look at your name, greet you, thank you, and move on. Nobody had more than three to 5 seconds with her until she got to me. Unfortunately, I didn't know it at the time. She knows and understands Greek because her father is from Greece. Her father was a part of the Austrian Empire, who was a part of the royal family of Greece. Yeah. He was a prince in Greece when he married Queen Elizabeth, or Princess Elizabeth at that time. Yeah. So she was not only raised in the Greek culture somewhat, but she knew the ancient history of the Olympics and massage therapy. And she had a 5-minute discussion with me about ancient Greek history. And she was so thrilled that a Greek young man is bringing massage back to the Olympics. I said, ma'am, I'm not the first. She says, no, you're the first that I've met. You're the first. And several years later, it ended up that we found out more of the story about how she was just really overwhelmed that there was this young Greek guy in Tallahassee helping her athletes become better. For the next 3 years, the British Olympic team would send over their junior Olympians, future Olympians, with some of their top coaches to train in Tallahassee every summer. And then and only then did my students at that time get to work on these athletes. So that was my introduction to Olympic work. And after that, it just kept expanding until I and others got involved with I think you had read it before, with the Athens Olympics. There were 5 of us who were co-directors together to organize the largest international team. Greece did not have a massage profession. So in 2002, when they came to the Winter Games in Salt Lake, they met several of the therapists that had worked with me in the '96 Olympics, plus the fellow who was organizing massage in Utah for the Salt Lake Games, Winter Games. So they wanted to see, how is the medical area established? How is it set up? What do you need? And then one of those therapists that was there was a young woman who had studied with me, but who was also from Greece. So they had somebody who spoke Greek. She mentioned me. We started talking, and we put in our proposal. And a couple of months later, we were approved to organize all the sports massage for the Athens game.
Did you have to relocate for any of this, George?
Not relocate. You have to go to the games. The games are 17 days in length for the Olympics, and another probably equal 2 weeks to 17 days a week after for the Paralympics. I could only go to the Olympics. Some of our people went for both Olympics and Paralympics. And it's funny, I remember coming back from the Olympics, the Athens Olympics in '04, thinking, why didn't I stay? I should have stayed. The Paralympians would have been incredible to work with. Do you know the standard? You know what disabilities or injuries constitute the Paralympics?
No, tell me, George.
Loss of limb, paralysis, or blindness. Those
Wow.
are the three. The American team, especially the loss of limb athletes, many of them were because of military service.
Oh, okay.
Many of them. So you have stories that come out about how they got injured. Some of them perhaps were born blind. Some of them may have become blind. Some of them may have been paralyzed because of a diving injury or some kind of accident. But the loss of a limb was often from some traumatic accident, and many, at least with the American squad, because of our time in Afghanistan and Iraq and different wars that had been fought at that time, were the military guys. One of my top graduates could not make the Olympics. And Mark Campbell asked me, George, I want to be involved. Can I go to the Paralympics? And so he went. His first Olympic Games were the '04 Paralympics. And he was so moved by the stories that he heard that when he came back, he called me up. He says, I'm going back to college. I want to get my master's in sports psychology. I want to understand more about the psychology of working with athletes. I would have loved having that knowledge when I was working with these Paralympians. Well, he not only did that, but because his thesis won honors, he gave some talk at a national conference for sports psychology. And someone in the audience from West Point asked him to come to West Point and basically give the same talk that he gave, summarizing his thesis about working with Paralympic athletes. Little did he know that this fellow was organizing the first Wounded Warrior Project for the U.S. Army.
Really?
And Mark was hired to help organize the 13 Army hospitals and the therapy that needed to happen for these wounded warriors who were returning from combat. And he did that so successfully that the Pentagon later hired him to do the same thing for all branches of service. And he's in his office at the Pentagon, maybe 7 or 8 years. And I hope I'm not telling this story wrong, but Mark Campbell is a wonderful, wonderful fellow that says he's at his office. And when he was a Florida State student, when I met him, he was graduating Florida State. He had played a little bit of baseball, but he'd gotten injured early in his college career, had to have some shoulder surgery, and really never could throw the way he did before. But baseball was his first love. He's at his office at the Pentagon. He gets a call from the Washington Nationals, the baseball team in Washington, saying, we saw this article about you being a sports psychologist working with the Pentagon. We're going to start using sports psychology for our team. Would you like to come and not interview with us, but have a meeting with us, be our consultant so we can hire the right person for that job? It ended up being Mark. And for the next 6 years, he's working with the Nationals when they won the World Series. And there's a connection there to me. He brought me into their training camp. Spring training is in Florida. A lot of it's in Florida. I got to meet with the sports medicine staff. A year later, I'm training the Washington Nationals sports therapy staff in the core myofascial techniques that I've been using with NFL and college athletes. So yeah, all these connections just keep coming back to support the work that we have done and the work in the future that we didn't even know we were going to do. But he really led me there. He thanks me for getting him to the Paralympics, and I thank him for bringing me into professional baseball.
Yeah, touch on your background working with the Massage Therapy Foundation.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that. The American Massage Therapy Association used to have spring educational conferences. So that spring, the conference was in Minnesota, I believe in Minneapolis, St. Paul. We go to the conference. Everybody is really excited about the exam has just come out. It's a big success. So many people purchased the first exam. It's going to be something that's going to change us. And I was telling people yes. And I'm now retired from the board. It's been wonderful working with you folks at AMTA. And the next speaker up is a woman named Grace Chan. Grace Chan was one of the owners of the Sutherland Chan School in Toronto. She's a Chinese Canadian, excellent massage therapist who later studied osteopathic medicine and is now an osteopath. Grace announces that the AMTA is giving her and a few others a grant to start the Massage Therapy Foundation for research, for community service, and for educational scholarships. I'm in the audience. She's looking at me and she says, and George, I want you to be one of my vice presidents.
Oh, wow.
From the stage. And I went to that meeting with the explicit instructions and approval of my wife, not only to retire from national certification, but to not be involved with any volunteer group for at least the next decade.
Yeah.
I've given them 2.5 years, nonstop work. And Patty says, just don't join something else. So I came back from that meeting and say, honey, I'm the new vice president of the Massage Therapy Foundation. I said, but I'm only going to raise money. I don't have to do the research. And that lasted for 8 years.
Wow.
I was both a VP in the early years and then the board of trustees. We really were the initial group that moved it along and got some great projects started, not just in research. Remember, it was also about community outreach, community service, and it was also about educational scholarships. So we did all three of those things. And one of the leading voices that I helped bring to the table was a fellow I went to Harvard with named David Eisenberg. And David is a medical doctor, trained also at Harvard Medical School, then became a professor at Harvard Medical School, but took a year off when he was in medical school to go to China to learn acupuncture. And David talked to me about it. He says, they wouldn't let me study acupuncture because I wasn't yet a doctor. Because I thought anybody could study acupuncture in China. So what they did is they gave him a teacher in acupressure, one of the leading Tuina instructors in Beijing was a blind massage therapist. And the first time anybody ever touched David's body was this blind massage therapist in China. And it changed his life in that first session that he had with him. And David got very involved with, again, back at that time, we were calling it what? Alternative therapy, maybe holistic therapy. David, under some of these techniques he learned in China and other things he incorporated into his medical practice, became such a favorite among his patient load that one of his extremely wealthy patients donated an ungodly amount of money to Harvard upon his passing. Under the auspices that all this money is given to David Eisenberg to start a department of integrative medicine at the Harvard Medical School. So David got that started. David came and met with us. He was part of our research advisory board, along with a number of other incredible researchers at that time. Candace Pert, have you heard that name?
It's not ringing any bells, George. Tell me more.
Biomolecular scientists and researchers helped to design a lot of the large molecule studies for cancer therapy. By the way, Ida Rolf, if we can go back, was a biochemist early in her career, one of the first women with a PhD from Columbia who ended up working at the Rockefeller Medical Research Center in her early years, helping to develop the first stages of chemotherapy drugs that were created in the 1940s and 50s. So we have but Candace Pert was an amazing person. We brought her and David Eisenberg and several others to our meetings to help us generate ideas for the kind of research that massage would fit in on. The problem was that most research, medical research, had to be double blind. And that means that either the person receiving the massage or the person giving the massage or the person evaluating the massage, two of them had to be blind to the fact that it was massage that was the therapy. You can't do that. The only person who can be blind is the person evaluating the outcome. They don't have to know what kind of treatment was given or anything about the person. So anyhow, we got past that. Single blind studies became acceptable for massage therapy, where only the person evaluating the outcomes was blind to who got massage, who got physical therapy, who got stretching, who got rest and relaxation. And some of the early groups, because of David Eisenberg's work all over the country, was with a large HMO out on the West Coast, that they did this first single blind study on how do we treat acute low back pain. Acute low back pain that structurally has been ruled out. We don't need surgery. We need simply to treat the symptoms and the ailments of low back pain. And so they did a massage. They had a massage group. They had a chiropractic group. They had a physical therapy group, and they had sort of exercise or R&R group. And they have evaluated short-term and long-term benefits. And in his early studies, massage was outshining all of them. But really, the person in research that grabbed a hold of all of us in the early years of the Massage Therapy Foundation was Tiffany Fields in Miami at the Touch Research Institute.
Sure.
And when we met her, we met her before the foundation started. It was the fall of '91. The AMTA convention was in Miami Beach, and she's in Miami. She wasn't the keynote speaker. She was the speaker at the educational luncheon. So the school directors, school teachers, we always had a separate luncheon, maybe 100 of us out of 1,000 people there. And she was our speaker that day and told us about her projects that she had been working on at Jackson Memorial Hospital. My years sprung into action. That's where I was born.
Oh.
I was born in the hospital where she was working in Miami. And then she talked about her daughter who was born premature at that same hospital. And she was the psychologist for the pediatric wing. So she had her own baby in the pediatric ward of the hospital where she worked. And at that time, the preemies, that would have been sometime in the, oh goodness, we met her in '92, probably late '80s. Her daughter was born. They would put a lot of these kids into incubators, and the mothers weren't allowed to come and hold them but for a couple of minutes a day. But there was an older nurse who knew her well because of her work with the ward and said, listen, you come up anytime you want. When the doctor's not here, we're taking your baby out. You're going to hold her. You're going to stroke her. You're going to love her. You're going to comfort her. And her daughter grew substantially quicker than all the other preemies. That was the first aha moment that Tiffany Field had about something about touch is helping my daughter. Is it just the mother's touch, or is it any touch? Well, she was a researcher. She wanted to find out. So her early studies, the first studies were on preemies, and then were on the mothers of preemies. And then it started branching out from there. But when she told us her story, I went up to her afterwards. I said, not only was I born in that hospital of an emergency cesarean birth some 41 years ago, but when I was in high school, I was the president of the Interact Club. It's a part of Rotary. It's the high school branch of Rotary. It's a service club. And the president got to pick what our community outreach was going to be. And I had a Greek doctor, again, another Greek connection who worked at the hospital. He said, George, bring those boys. Well, you're all on the football team, right? He said, yeah, bring them to the pediatric ward and read stories to the kids that are in the hospital. Play with them, do things with them. None of my guys wanted to do that. I had to force the club to do it, and they loved it. Some of them worked many more hours than they should have. It became our favorite thing. The year before, the president picked out painting the lines in the school parking lot. That was our community outreach.
Yeah.
That was the effect that we had on the community, was painting brighter yellow lines. So I got this thing started, and I told Tiffany about it. And she started thinking, oh, I could do the same thing. I could bring in high school kids and help us with these studies. She was already using massage students from Iris Berman School, the educating hand school in Miami, to do some of the research massage. But she started thinking of more ways that she could incorporate the community into helping people heal. And so I had that experience from high school, and she woke that back up in us. And then Life magazine did a big special edition just on her work. And I think at some point around there in the early '90s, she was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Medicine. She didn't win it that year, but she was one of the few that were nominated for her work on massage research.
Wow. That's awesome. I love that story, George. Let's go ahead and shift our gears then. In the time that you've been working in massage therapy, what significant changes, trends have you witnessed the profession take on?
In the earliest years, it was simply the acceptance, the more acknowledgement that the term massage was a positive term. That was in the early years, the late '70s, early '80s. So many people, when I told them that I was a massage therapist, would immediately roll their eyes and go to the most base understanding of what possibly that could mean. Something about only either working on the uber wealthy or being a sex slave to somebody. It was not accepted as a profession. And I remember even my mother, my dear mother, her mother was a massage therapist, not legally, but a Greek healer, would say, George, you can't tell people that. it's not right that you went to Harvard and then you're going to say that you're a massage therapist. And she would kept saying it over and over. You can't tell people you're a masseuse. I say, no, Mom, women are masseuses, men are masseurs. She says, don't be smart with me. I say, Mom, you sent me to Harvard to be smart. It's okay. I say,
Yeah.
I promise you, one day this is going to be really important for our culture, our community, our life, our health. I says, I know how much massage has helped me. And I haven't told you my story yet. The little story about the neck injury is only the tip of the iceberg when it came for what structural integration, specifically in massage in general, did to improve my overall health. But it was that kind of attitude that we saw shift, not in the early 80s, maybe as much in the later 80s. Sports massage certainly led the way. Us getting out into the communities for events, for races, for all kinds of activities going on in every local community and being present, being there to help. We were seen as community partners, not just somebody who was strangely working in some adult rated store where massage also happened in the back rooms. But then it was the research. National certification may have been the beginning of it, but in the early 90s, it was the research that started to come out. I still credit Tiffany Field and the Touch Research Institute with a lot of that. That got nationwide, if not international, notice. Is really including massage as a part of whole health rather than just some aspect of stress reduction. The idea that massage was only good for relaxation was quickly erased, and people like Paul St. John and Judith Delaney Walker, all of those people made their impact in neuromuscular therapy for what they call pain erasure. I remember Paul advertising that term, pain erasure. I'd never heard anybody say that for this time. And he's advertising the best techniques available for pain erasure. And quickly, our own research within the AMTA showed that people more and more were coming for massage because of trauma and pain, not just for relaxation therapy. So that change, that understanding, really helped a lot. Now, there were medical leaders in the field way before us. They may not have called their work massage, but all of them were doing some form of manual therapy, from Milton Traeger, from Alexander Lowen. All of these were MDs. Alexander was both an MD and a psychiatrist. Milton was an MD, but the Traeger work, the bioenergetics, all involved some form of manual therapy or touch therapy. Ida Rolf being a biochemist who got involved in structural integration. And the old osteopaths, if we go back to the origin of osteopathy in America, it was a father and son, the Taylors, George Taylor, I forget the name of the son, who started it in Missouri, I believe, if I got my history right. And osteopathic medicine was really the first group who said fascia is the most important tissue in the body. Nobody was talking about fascia. That didn't even really come out explosively, even though Ida Rolf's book in the late 70s had a chapter on it. Others, Dean Juhan, who wrote Job's Body, he was the anatomist for Milton Traeger at the Traeger Institute. And his chapter, again, that would have been in the early 80s, I believe, but his chapter on fascia was one of the best I had read at that time. But it took until 2007 before we had that gathering at Harvard Medical School of the first international research conference for fascia. That was an explosive time. That really propelled us into an international audience of not just scientists studying about fascia, but those of us in the clinical side who were using that work to understand better what the benefits were of appropriately working with the fascial bodies.
Right. Yeah. And that's so important, I think, in research is that researchers, but also those that are clinicians and are actually working with the people, right?
Right. And there was a third group there. We had the clinicians, we had the researchers, and then we had the educators. And the educators had to put all of that information together. How can we take this new knowledge about what the collagen molecule really is all about? I remember thinking the first time that Bill Williams talked about the clockwise spiral of the within the collagen molecule, like DNA with its double helix, collagen has a triple helix.
Hmm.
And independently, each of those helixes, before they became a combined molecule with two other helixes, were spinning in a counterclockwise rotation. When they got into each other's magnetic field, the three of them, they reversed order and started spinning clockwise.
Hmm.
And so Bill Williams was the first person I ever heard talk about, this orientation of rotation within the molecule, and that made that molecule not only the largest single protein molecule in the body. I think 40% of all of our protein is collagen, but it's the largest molecule in the human body, and it has the most tensile strength. That sort of answered a lot of questions back in the late 70s, early 80s for me about why is it important that we're studying this fascia? I thought it was all about muscles, tendons, and bones. I didn't know epimysium from periosteum. I didn't know anything about that. But it was that early writings of others and then the research conference itself that brought so much more information to the table. And there were just amazing people who had been working on it, some of them from the 1980s. I remember people were shocked that some of these scientists started studying fascia in the 80s. And I'm thinking, well, the osteopaths were doing it back in the 20s and 30s. Ida Rolf was doing it in the 50s and 60s. He said, but the first recognition came much, much later. So I was so impressed by the people that we got to meet at that first conference. And looking at the history, the one story today that I discovered was my misunderstanding of Per Ling's involvement with Swedish massage.
Okay.
And I had heard this story told a number of ways, but in the early years, he was always considered the father of Swedish massage.
Right.
Really, he was, but yet I taught in Stockholm decades ago at the Axelson Institute, the largest school of Swedish massage in the world. They have 5 campuses throughout Scandinavia and even one in Osaka, Japan. And they train 5,000 students a year. And I asked their top dean of faculty, tell me what you know about Per Ling. Is he the father of Swedish massage? He says, absolutely not. Johann George Metzger from Austria is.
Okay.
I said, what are you talking about? We've been trained in America. Per Ling's our father of massage. He says, no, he's the father of medical gymnastics, what we now call physiotherapy.
Okay.
He's the father of physical therapists, not a massage therapist. And so today I went back and looked at all that history and read more about Metzger, and again, another medical doctor who was using manual therapy as a way of helping people. But he came, 60, 70 years after Per Ling, and he's considered the father of massage, at least from the medical approach. There was one other story, we can get to it later, but you do know about the doctor named Kellogg.
Oh, yeah.
You know about him. All right. And you know the book that he wrote.
Yeah.
And it's that book that almost got me, I don't want to say arrested, but the biggest trouble I was ever in teaching was because of his book. And it was the first time I ever taught in Ohio at an AMTA state chapter meeting. I was training them in what I call back specific, a series of techniques and protocols for the paraspinals, the scapular region, and the iliofemoral region, finishing with the cervical column. And my first stroke, the first 30 seconds teaching, I'm showing them strokes that are moving down the paraspinals from upper thoracic all the way to the base of the sacrum. And somebody called me out and said, we're not allowed to do that in Ohio. That's against our massage rules.
Oh.
I said, what is? He says, you're going away from the heart. And I had learned the concept in Swedish massage about all strokes going towards the heart. I didn't know the state of Ohio made it a rule.
Legislated it.
And then I learned why many years later. Kellogg's book was the book that they used in their curriculum from 1915. His book came out earlier in the 1900s, early 1900s. Yeah. His nephew was a doctor in Ohio who was on the medical board in 1915 when they incorporated massage as an allied branch of medicine. So the first massage board in Ohio was under the medical board. And this nephew of Dr. Kellogg made his uncle's book the book for Ohio. You could only teach and practice massage based upon the scientific principles of Kellogg's book.
Isn't that something?
And I knew nothing about him until I read the book and then saw the movie Road to Wellville. Did you ever?
Yeah. I've seen that one.
So I would recommend to any massage therapist see that movie to understand what was going on in massage therapy and other forms of healing in the early 1900s.
Right. It'll give you respect for to where we are now. George, I'm wondering if you can talk to me about when you started your school in the 90s.
Uh, I think I mentioned earlier that we sort of inherited a school from one of my mentors, Al Drake, who had a part-time evening school for several years in Tallahassee. He was helped by the school owners in Tampa of the Suncoast School. I believe I mentioned them too. Dan and Tekla Ulrich helped him get his school started. And I was teaching for him. I was teaching both history of massage, interestingly enough, and also the Florida laws and rules. And he asked me if I'd be interested, perhaps in the near future, of taking over the school. When we decided to do this, we knew that we would want a full-time school. We needed a larger facility. We found our name, I think I mentioned earlier, in Lanzarote in the Canary Islands. And when we came back from that trip, we started working towards opening the school at the beginning of 1990. The one area where school standards seemed to be less than what I had thought was appropriate to be a massage therapist was both the age of the therapist and prerequisite training. I don't know if other states had this history, but with Florida starting their license in 1943, the first rules were written that you had to be 16 years of age. It did not include high school education, just a minimum of 16 years of age. By
Wow.
the time I became a therapist in 78, the requirement was 18 years of age and a high school education or GED. We felt, as I had for a number of years, I was, goodness, 12 years of being a massage therapist before I became a school owner. But we felt that it was important that the responsibility level, the maturity level, was ensured by a slightly higher age. Ours was 20 years of age, and education and or work experience. For us, that meant a minimum of 2 years of education or military service or 2 years of a responsible job where we could have their supervisor or owner of the company talk to us about their responsibility level.
Hmm.
So we did that. I think I have talked to probably at that time 20 or so school owners. The Council of Schools by the AMTA had started in the 80s, and the last 2 years of our involvement with the Council of Schools were actually prior to us starting the Core Institute in 88 and 89. I went to the Council of Schools meeting, met with a number of school owners and directors, and many of them, when I brought up the issue of age and some higher level of education or experience rather than high school, thought that their schools would not exist without that 18 years of age, without that minimum of a high school education. So
Mhm.
for us, the big issue was moving towards a higher standard for enrollment. But then also we decided that the core myofascial therapy that I had been teaching under the SOMA Institute as Somassage should be a part of their entry-level training. So we advanced our program for an increased number of hours. We moved to 750 hours with 3 semesters of massage therapy that included Swedish massage as an entry-level semester, then sports and medical massage, and then the myofascial therapy. So all of our students over 24 years received all of that education, and I believed had more advanced both standards, protocols, techniques that would make them more successful initially out of school. That was something that only a few other schools that I met through Council of Schools meetings agreed to. There were a few, I know in North Carolina, the Body Therapy Institute had a higher level of education and age required. And I thought that that was the move that education should have at that time. For us, being a school in Tallahassee also meant being involved in the community. And it was because of Catherine Hansman, who came down from the Potomac Institute and moved to Tallahassee in the early 90s after getting involved with us, really introduced us to community outreach. That was something that was lacking in our program in the early 3 or 4 years until she became a part of the faculty. And after that, our involvement in the community increased exponentially. We were already doing sports massage events. That was one way of getting involved in the community, but going to different agencies, going to different um, nonprofits so that we could support. I remember one of the ones was a women's center, and our female students were allowed to go and do seated massage. Almost all of our community outreach was based upon seated massage for women who were in need, but also for the workers in the facility. And then we started realizing that we needed to reach out to the employees of many of these great facilities, and the hospital became our next major community outreach project. We started organizing that every holiday, myself and a group of students would go to the waiting rooms of the surgical centers at the hospital and work on family members who were there at a very difficult time in their loved one's life. During a holiday, whether it was Thanksgiving or Christmas or even Easter time, we would be there working, doing seated massage for family members of those who were in serious condition. All of these things added up to the school becoming a really well-known a partner, not just to the local community, but to the state community also, because we were in Tallahassee. We got involved with the Emergency Management Center, and there was one year that the state of Florida had 4 hurricanes, and we more or less did nonstop seated massage at the state of Florida Emergency Management Center. That's where both the governor's office was located during these hurricanes, but also the a Red Cross, the Coast Guard, all of the different agencies who had to coordinate their services to provide support for hurricane victims had to be there. And it went on for months at a time during the hurricane season that our students were a part of that. It was interesting in the later in the 90s, probably 98, when the governor of Florida, who had just been elected, his office called, and the secretary wanted to know if I would be willing to come and do a session for the new governor. At that time, it was Governor Bush, Jeb Bush.
Ah.
I told him I'd be happy to. Our school was only 3 blocks away from the governor's mansion. And I told the secretary, please have the governor call and come by at any time. I'd be glad to schedule with him, even if it's after hours or on the weekends. And I was told at that point that the only way the governor could receive a massage is if I was willing to come to the governor's mansion on Sunday night. Now,
Interesting.
I had never worked many house calls, or at least early in my career, I perhaps did a few, but house calls weren't a part of what I did. And Sunday night would not have been the night I would have chosen to do house calls. I went to the first one thinking, well, let's see how this goes. And with the positive reception that I got from Governor Bush and his history of using massage therapy, at that point, I believe for 12 years, since some golf injuries had created some issues with his lower back. And he says, George, without this, I cannot start my week being the governor as well. He actually went back to the ancient Greek philosophy. I have to have sound mind and a sound body. And I believe that massage therapy helps me with both of those. By the way, that was the essence of the Hippocratic theory of all medicine in ancient Greece, was a sound mind and the sound body. By the way, did you know that Hippocrates talked about the 5 spokes on the wheel of medicine? He had
I
5 different disciplines that you had to learn, and he called them the spokes of the wheel of medicine. To me, sounding more like a Native American terminology.
Right. Yeah.
You know what they are?
No, I have a feeling if I tried, I would one be making it up or two get it very wrong.
Okay, it is surgery, it is herbology or plant-based food for healing. It is massage therapy, it is hydrotherapy, and it's prayer.
Hmm.
Prayer was the 5th one. But when asked by his students, which of these do you use most on yourself? He says, well, I enjoy all of them, but I don't want to live without massage. So that was some statement supposedly that Hippocrates made, and I'll live to that. By the way, Hippocrates was in the 2006 inaugural class, the charter class of the Massage Hall of Fame.
Ah, yes.
So was Per Ling.
And yourself, if I'm not mistaken, right,
There
George?
were 6 men and 6 women, and I'm the only living male in 2006 to receive that honor at the event where it was held. Yes, I am one of those people. Robert Calvert was also one, and he had just passed away the year before. So that was very, very sad. Judy came to accept the honor for him, and I was remembering the times that she and Robert and I got to spend together in the Canary Islands. The year after I went to the Canaries, Robert and Judy came over for an international congress that the Ulriches from the Suncoast School and I and some people in Germany organized, bringing massage therapists together from both Europe and the United States and Canada. And Robert was a part of that, and that would have been in 1990. I think he passed away a few years later, but in 2006 we were first honored with that, and yeah, I was in that first charter class. I remember accepting the award, looking around the room and saying, the other 5 men receiving this award have all passed away. I'm not sure what that means for my immediate future,
Oh,
but I hope I last a few more years and see this being handed off. That there were so many people that have since received it, almost all of whom have been on your podcast so far. So it certainly was an honor to being in the first class of Hall of Fame.
I bet. Yeah, well, there are still a few out there that we've got to search down and get them on.
Good, good, good. You will. You're a historian. You're gonna dig and find all the information that you need.
Here's hoping.
In the first time that I worked on him, we realized that we were politically on opposite ends of the field. We
Uh,
agreed that we would never discuss politics or religion. Um, and yet I admired him for other reasons, especially that his father had been the one who introduced him and other family members to massage therapy.
hmm.
And I learned at that time that his father started receiving massage in Hawaii during World War II after he was shot down after his first mission. His first mission was off of a aircraft carrier called the San Jacinto. And I mentioned to Governor Bush that that was the same aircraft carrier that my father-in-law served on during World War II in the Pacific. We let that go. We never talked about it again. And then 3 years later, mom and dad, George and Barbara Bush, are in Tallahassee on their way back to Texas, visiting for the weekend with their son and daughter-in-law and grandchildren. And I get a call from the governor, which was very, very unusual that he would call me on the weekend to say, George, when you come tomorrow night, can you stay longer? I'd like you to work on my father.
Wow.
And I got to work with George Bush and learn a little bit more about his story. It was interesting that when he went to Hawaii for his rehab from the injuries he received when he was shot down, Lomi Lomi was a part of that treatment. And he remembered that. He made massage therapy a part of his life from World War II on, and then passed that on to his sons and daughters and perhaps other family members.
In-
I mentioned to President Bush when I was able to work with him about my father-in-law, and he lit up. He could not believe that he was with somebody who was related to uh, 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 a sailor who was on that ship with him. And 2 weeks later, we received a package from the president with a letter for my father-in-law, thanking him for his service, and then also giving him a tie clip with the presidential seal on it, which he wore on his golf shirt collar for the rest of his life. So it was one of the happier days. So the fact that massage therapy can bring other people's history together.
yeah.
Again, President Bush and my father-in-law, who was a part of the truck drivers union in New York City. He was a blue collar guy the whole way, but all of a sudden, towards the end of his life, he is recognized not only by a former sailor but a former president of the United States. And massage made that happen.
Yeah, that's absolutely awesome. And it's interesting that you talk about President Bush's introduction to it happening in Hawaii during World War II, because Hawaii wasn't a state at the time, right?
No, but that is where the Navy had had its main station. You remember Pearl Harbor was Hawaii.
Right.
So we were there for a good long time. Yeah, it was still a territory,
Yeah.
I believe, at that time. The headquarters of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. So rather than taking him back to California, which would have been the next big naval hospital, he went to Hawaii. He recovered, and then he flew another 30 or 40 missions. I'm not sure of the exact number, but in his first mission, he was shot down. And imagine that the men on his boat didn't know really what had happened to him until much later they learned that he was rescued and taken back to Hawaii.
Wow. That's a really cool story. Let's do a segue into talking about preservation of history and sharing. I like that you included that one of the first classes that you were teaching was history of massage. How did that experience go?
It went roughly in the beginning because there wasn't a lot of literature to read. Again, back at that time, we did not have many books on the history of massage therapy, if any. There were some articles that Patricia Benjamin had written for the Massage Therapy Journal, so I scoured as many of those as I could find. A few years later, I met Patricia in 1990 at the beginning of the national certification movement and heard many more stories and couldn't believe that she had amassed this valuable knowledge that she had gained over 10 or 15 years of being the historian for the AMTA. And I realized that books needed to be written about it, at least articles like what Patricia had been doing needed to be read and understood and made a part of our community knowledge. That knowledge base needed to grow into historical work. And I was always excited when I learned about the ancient history. I was more interested in what the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, the Ayurvedic movement in India, and of course, the Chinese and Japanese movement in massage therapy and holistic health. All of those supported an overall theory and understanding of how massage was utilized for both health care and psychological care.
Interesting. I like I like discussing with you that you have a particular interest or an affinity for more ancient um, systems of
Yeah.
massage. I am more obsessed with modern, contemporary, from like turn of the century on, but I'm just interested what draws you to those ancient, what value do you see in the ancient history?
Again, it went back to my grandmother and listening to her stories when we were children, not just about how she learned massage therapy from her mother and her grandmother, but she would talk about the fact that massage was a part of the cultural life of Greece all the way back to ancient times. She knew, by the way, my one of my sets of grandparents were from the island of Kalymnos. It is next door, 20 minutes away by small boat to the island of Kos. And Kos was the home of Hippocrates. It's where he taught. I had no understanding early in my life that that was the case. I thought he was, of course, in Athens, teaching people who would come to the biggest city of ancient Greece. That was not the case. If you wanted to study with Hippocrates, you had to go to this little island of Kos.
Hmm.
Um, so that island became important to me in 1972 when I first went to Kalymnos to visit my family. I could see Kos off in the distance, and I had to go over and spend at least a day there to find the olive tree that Hippocrates supposedly taught under. And there is an olive grove with a plaque in his name. Have no idea which the tree is. Of course, it's thousands of years ago that this happened, but I felt something special when I was on that island. It was reawakened 8 years later in 1980 when I was invited to come to a German psychological retreat in the island of Santorini. I had met a German psychiatrist in Tallahassee. He invited me at that time to come to Munich and Stuttgart and work with him in his clinic. And before making that decision, he sort of upped the ante. He says, I'm hosting a retreat for the month of May in 1980 in this Greek island. I'd like to fly you there, house you, and you be the massage therapist for the people at the retreat. There were 20 to 30 people coming in every 10 days to study with him. My job was to be available in the afternoons to work on those who wanted massage therapy. They didn't know that my work at that time with structural integration he did, but he was setting up the ability of me to connect with as many people in the psychological world from Munich and Stuttgart, a few from Frankfurt, and say structural integration should be added to your practice if you're trying to expand and become a more integrative facility. That helped me make the decision and to make the move to Germany in the fall of 1980. When I was in Santorini, I realized the first time from stories I was hearing from the local people that this was the island that Plato said was Atlantis. And so the old history of the volcano that exploded there 3,500 years ago. By the way, it was called a submarine volcano because it sunk 40% of the island. But the culture that was living on that island, the community of people living on that island at the time, were Minoans who were sent there by the king of the Minoan Empire to create. They were the philosophers, the teachers, the poets, the musicians, the dancers, the artists. They were sent to create in a community of like-minded people. So he had an idea to create this ideal civilization from those in his culture who were supporting the evolution of that culture, both in arts and in letters, perhaps also in athletics, or at least in dance and movement. So I thought, this is fascinating. This is something I need to dig more into. And then luckily for the next 2 years, from 1980 through 1981, I spent 1 month, the month of May, on that island every year. And I got to meet more and more of the local people on that island, which led me to a monastery. I met the older head monk. He was probably in his 80s when I first met him. I'm lucky that I speak enough Greek that we could have a little bit of understanding with each other. And then he gave me the history of how massage and touch and the use of oil was always a part of the religion, the modern day Christian religion of Greek Orthodoxy. And I hadn't thought about that, but we anoint people with oil all the time. We use water on basil as a way to bless people with a sprinkling of holy water on oil. So whether we call it hydrotherapy or whether we call it massage with oil, the idea of using water and oil was a part of the religion, not just of the medical culture. So there's all kinds of connections that I was finding. And the biggest one was that every time I was in Greece, I would have these dreams of my grandmothers teaching me these things. One had been a healer, the other was more of a philosopher. I knew by the third or fourth night that I was there that the culture was back in with me when I woke up that day, realizing that my dream was in Greek, not in English. And that was always something that was unusual. It didn't happen here in the United States, but in Greece, every time I go, it happens, midway into the first week that I'm there, that I'm not only dreaming in Greek, but all of a sudden these flood of memories start coming back about learning Greek and learning some of the philosophy from my grandmothers. So
Wow.
my grandmothers were probably more influential to me, wanting to understand more about ancient Greek history and mythology than anything else. So I was very, very happy that I got the experience again to return in 2004 to be a part of the Athens Olympics.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm wondering, George, do you engage in a practice of preserving or collecting massage therapy history? Do you have a collection?
I have a collection of articles and books, and even of some art books, which I found interesting. In Germany, there was a great book I found really on medicine, and it was, I believe, a French author, but I found this book in German. It was written in German, and it showed, interesting enough, cartoons of different forms of medicine from ancient time all the way through modern time.
Hmm.
I then learned from Patricia Benjamin, and we were in Minneapolis together, that there was a museum of medical quackery that existed in Minneapolis or St. Paul, one of those two towns that I didn't know about. And she again had been looking and sort of informed those of us who were within her radar of some of her finds. So when we were in Minnesota, I believe that was in 1992, when we first heard about the Massage Therapy Research Foundation, that we went to visit this museum of medical quackery. And that history sparked something else. Many massage therapists, myself included, really owed a lot to the chiropractic profession early on for allowing us to come in and work with them. My first three jobs as a massage therapist were with chiropractors. The final one being in New York, and I learned more about their history of being labeled as medical quacks by the AMA and the AHA early in the 1950s when they set up the Committee on Medical Quackery and really went after the chiropractic community full force. So I didn't know any of that history until I started learning from some of these chiropractors what they had gone through. We had our own history, and I've collected articles from the time I was on the board or notes that I have from different board meetings of how it took us 3 years in Florida to finally get approval by the legislature um, to call ourselves massage therapists. Up until the late 1980s, we were massage practitioners,
Hmm.
even though the first statement about massage in the state law was that since massage is therapeutic, we need to create these laws and rules to organize the profession of massage, or the industry of massage. I'm not sure what term they used back then, but we used that argument, and it took 3 years of arguing with the legislature to finally get ourselves approved as massage therapists. And the name of the board was also finally changed to the Board of Massage Therapy sometime in the early to mid 90s. So those kinds of articles and issues I'm more aware of. Patricia Benjamin wrote an excellent book on the history of massage that I still use to this day. But I think we need more research into the ancient history. That's something perhaps that in my retirement years I can start doing more of. And I think that we need to understand how this information, which we know the Silk Route from China all the way through India, the Middle East, and all the way to Egypt and Greece and Rome, was really the way that people communicated not just their knowledge, but their protocols, their techniques. That a lot of what I thought, I may have mentioned this earlier, even cupping that I thought was developed in Greece, I know now that they learned it through the information that was sent along the Silk Route.
Yeah, awesome. I like the way that you're thinking. I love the idea of grassroots research into history. So I want to ask you, what do you think the future holds for massage therapy in terms of historical research?
Well, I think, first of all, creating a society of massage archives like you and a number of others have done is an incredible big step that we are making to document at least the history that we know right now. But to go back into a culture, I remember I was surprised when I went to teach in Sweden at the Axelson Institute that they have very little history of Swedish massage in terms of what we were being taught in the United States. Their understanding of their history was very different than what we have claimed that their history is. So I think we need to go to these cultures, whether it's the Scandinavian cultures, the Mediterranean cultures, India and the Ayurvedic culture, and even back to China. I think I mentioned before how much going to China affected Dr. David Eisenberg, who is now the director of integrative medicine at the Harvard Medical School. If he had not gone there for a year while he was a med student, he would have never learned about acupressure and then later about acupuncture. And learning that, he was able to include it in his treatment of his patients back in Boston. So I think that we need to have more outreach to those organizations that exist in those countries. There have been a few international gatherings. The first one I remember was in Montreal, was an international gathering of massage therapists, and we met massage therapists from all over the world. But we met a Korean massage therapist who was one of their leading educators, who was giving us information about the Korean style of massage that I knew nothing of, the Jin Shindo work, and so just connecting with people and hearing their stories is really the gathering of history. And hopefully, some of us will do more of that, write more about it, and we're hoping that there's an interest in reading it. I know that for myself, Patricia Benjamin is the person who made that happen. She
Gotcha.
inspired me.
Yeah, she's definitely left her imprint, certainly on the Society of Massage Archives. If we hope for more massage history research, do you have any thoughts on how practitioners today can benefit from an understanding of the history of massage?
I think it's important when we practice a discipline within massage therapy that we try to understand its connection to other disciplines that may have existed earlier. In structural integration, we have an understanding now that Ida Rolf's work was the seminal work that created this body of information, but that osteopathy and osteopathic medicine was a part of her history. She reached out to osteopaths to help her with issues she had involving her back, her spinal arthritis, other medical issues that she had, and she received more benefit from that, along with beginning the practice of yoga, is what I was told at some meeting with a group of people from the Rolf Institute, that yoga may have also been. So having this connection of Rolfing to both yoga in terms of structural alignment and also to osteopathic medicine in terms of techniques and protocols, I think is important to understand that most of this work wasn't created in a vacuum. It has some link to other work that already existed. And again, if that's not enough reason why, let's look back into time and see how the development of the work I'm doing now started perhaps not 10 years ago, not 30 years ago, but 1,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. That there is this connection through a touch that we all have.
Excellent. George, I want us to change our focus again.
Okay.
We had a discussion about your work in the Olympics in the 2000s. How did that evolve into your work with the NFL in the 2010s?
Right. In the 2000s, I'm sorry, in the 1900s, 1994, when the British team made the decision to train in Tallahassee, one of their partners, of course, was Florida State University. I had already been trying for a number of years to get my foot in the door at Florida State. While they did not have a budget for it, the athletic trainer who would help me with my rugby injury was still there and would recommend that certain athletes contact me and receive some of my session work that they would pay for out of their own pocket. And one of those athletes, a wonderful person who was on the volleyball team named Gabrielle Reese, became one of my first FSU athletes that I took through the 10 sessions of structural integration. She was moved so much by how the work helped her with her performance. She was an All-American. She was 6'3". She had lumbar issues, but she was also a model. Every summer she'd leave campus and go to Europe and model at some of the top shows in there. And so she would come back with a lot of money, more than what most college athletes had. And based upon the work I was doing with her, she bought sessions for every member of the volleyball team that played with her. I kept going to the football team. They kept saying the same thing. It's not in our budget. We really can't afford that right now. And it wasn't until a new coach came in 2011 that I got the call that really changed our whole relationship with football, at least. The new coach, a man named Jimbo Fisher, had been used to massage therapy being a part of his athletes' conditioning. He wanted a massage team to work with his team, so we began one in 2011. I selected 12 of the top therapists that I had trained who were still working and living in Tallahassee, and we worked with the team that first season free of charge because there was no budget for it. They gave us tickets to the games and some gear that we could wear, but we were told if the players respond well to this, we can promise you that you will be in our budget next year. Not only did they respond well, but the head athletic trainer at that time, a guy named Jake File, wrote an article for the athletic training a magazine or a journal at that time, talking about how the use of massage therapy in the first year and going into the spring of the second year had lowered the soft tissue injury rate by over 70%, that they weren't dealing with a lot of the soft tissue trauma that they had been in earlier years. We were lucky to be there when a young man enrolled in 2013, became the quarterback of the team, and led them to a national title. That young man, Jameis Winston, who's now in the NFL, when he left FSU, said, "What do I do now? I'm used to having your massages twice a week. What do I do? How do I keep this going?" And other athletes leaving Florida State and moving into the NFL were saying the same thing. So I made the decision at that time to get involved with the evolution of becoming a college football and moving into the National Football League. And I knew somebody that ran a combine training camp. That is the NFL Combine is a 5-day event where the top college athletes who are going into the NFL come together to be evaluated by all of the teams. So there are certain skills and events that they have to participate in. And I knew that many of our FSU athletes went to one specific combine training center in Florida, in South Florida, in Boca Raton, called XPE Sports. I reached out to them. We started working together. That took a number of years. I didn't get to start working with them until 2016, even though we were still working with FSU from 2011 on. And that first year I was there, we met some of the top young college athletes who were moving on to the NFL. Not only work with them, but when they got selected in the draft, then my job was, how do I find them a therapist in the city where they're moving to give them the same services? So our work with XPE Sports and with the NFL Combine Prep is what it was called, existed for another 5 years. Our final year was unfortunately in 1920-21, when we had to sort of cease working with the athletes because of COVID. So there was 1 year that we took off. But at that point, we had already trained several hundred therapists from all over the country. We had 20 or 30 massage therapists either hired by NFL teams or working independently with NFL athletes. I continued my work with Jameis that I continue to this day. So twice every week during the season and once a week during the off season, I'm flying to wherever he is to work with him and provide him with the massage therapy support. And his work, he has gone through the 10 sessions numerous times. So every session that I do on him is sort of a grandchild of some of the work he had when he went through the 10 sessions. He likes the deeper work. We know the specific areas that he needs the most relief from. And we work with him the day after a game and 2 days before a game during the season. So I'm there every Monday and every Friday to work with him, whether he was here in Tampa for 5 years, then in New Orleans for 4 years, this last year in Cleveland, next year, who knows where. And because of him doing this, other members of his team who had not experienced this when they were in college, some of them hadn't experienced massage even in the NFL, became open to the idea of utilizing massage therapy as a performance enhancer.
Interesting. I'm I'm a little hung up, so forgive me if I go in a different direction from you right
That's
now,
all
but
right.
you said something that I think is pretty profound. You described the sessions that you're giving currently as grandchildren of the first massages that
Of the 10 sessions, right?
yeah. And I'm wondering, I like thinking of it that way. I'm wondering, do you feel that through your decades in working, do you feel that it's getting better? Because I think grandchildren gives the idea of, I don't know, sloppiness, uh, for lack of
I
a
should.
better word. But it also gives you room for experimentation, right? Is the other side of that coin.
It does. I think with every athlete that I've worked with, whether they were Olympic athletes or collegiate athletes or professional athletes, as you get to know them, as you understand their training regimen better, as you understand the effects that playing that sport has on their body long term, you start to evolve and develop techniques and protocols that are specific to their needs. And a good example is with CTE, the concussion uh, um, I don't want to call it a disease. It's a syndrome to be more than anything. It's because of too many minor concussions, this damaged brain begins to show signs of de-evolution. And I learned from one of the exercise physiologists that worked with the University of Pittsburgh during the early studies on CTE that one of the most chronic areas where this tension of CTE is held is at the occipital ridge. So the work that I was already doing on the occipital ridge may have been effective, but I thought we need to increase the amount of time that we spend with the occipital ridge every session. I was already doing work there, but I know with my football athletes, I've increased the amount of time, pressure, and their ability to move while I'm working on them, that rotational ability of both the cervical column and the lumbar column. We were always doing deep work in the lower back, we were doing deep work in the neck, but we increased the amount of time spent with both, especially with the cervical column because of CTE. That helped a lot. Understanding how these bodies are incredibly beat up, if I can use that term, from just one game, and knowing how to organize the Monday massage after the game versus what I'm doing on Friday to get them ready to perform at a higher level. That those are two different sessions. Those are two different focal points, and I have the athlete work with me as much as possible to help me understand the areas that they feel need the most improvement.
Interesting. How do you think working with NFL athletes and also training therapists that would eventually secure positions with NFL, how do you think that has had an effect on yourself as a practitioner?
I've been blessed over the 45 years of teaching. I've had so many people move on to a higher level of performance in their own practice. And I keep hearing stories about what that has meant to their quality of life, not just as a therapist, but as a person raising a family. So many of them have told me, the younger therapists, how if they had not reached that level, they have not believed in themselves enough to strive towards working with professional athletes and achieving a higher level of income, even from these athletes, that they could not have raised the families that they had. What I love most, and it's happened several times, is when all of a sudden I get a call from a son or daughter of one of the therapists that I trained, either in the 90s or early 2000, that has now become a massage therapist. I have just recently gotten a call from my uh, sister's. I want to say this correctly. I have a half sister who had a son who was a musician, and I knew him as a talented musician most of his adolescent life. And I got a call last year saying he was starting massage school in Indiana.
Wow.
And I got a call a month ago saying he's just graduated. When can we send him down to Florida to study with you? So, me being able to train relatives of mine, this would be a wonderful nephew who I have not been able to spend much time with. I have two daughters who were trained in massage therapy at our school, and even my grandchildren. I have four grandsons. All of them have been a part of my training here in Florida, is that I need models for all of my classes that I teach. And so all of my grandchildren have come through. My older grandsons in their 20s, and even my grandsons in their teens have received this work. So that connection to family life of not just mine but of other people. One of my top students ever was a 3-year-old when I started working on her mother and father, and she used to jump on the table at the end of the massage. That was one of the couples I would go to their house for in the 1980s. She would jump on the table asking for a massage at the end of her mom and dad's massage. And I'd always work on her for 10 or 15 minutes, never thinking that 20 years later, she's going to show up at the Core Institute, become a student, and become one of our best therapists that we've ever trained.
Wow. That's,
So to me, that's history of massage.
yeah.
That's the impact that this connectivity that we have through a touch can go through generations of families. And I understand better now how, with my own Greek family, that knowledge of massage therapy probably existed for 1,000 years. Do I have a possession of that history? No, but I know it had to be there. I know my great grandmothers and the ones before them would have been teaching all of those who came after. So the fact that I'm now able to teach both my family members and family members of some of my former students makes me very, very feeling like I'm connected to a longer history.
Yeah. Keeping massage in the as in a family affair, right?
Yeah, I've met so many that it has been that. I was impressed even when I taught in Alaska, meeting some of the native Inuits who had massage as a part of their history, and they were using bones from whales as a part of their tools in their massage practice. And I had seen stone massage before. I'd seen ivory used from Japan, the Kai stick. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that. It's a scraping tool made from ivory tusk. I had been given one as a gift. It was hundreds and hundreds of years old. I never used it in my practice, but somebody in New York that I was working with thought enough of the work that I did for her that she gave it to me as a gift. And I learned that these were scraping and massage tools that had been developed in Japan hundreds, if not thousands of years ago.
Wow. Wow.
So the idea that massage is done the same way everywhere, we know that's not true, but we know there's still a connection to how it's been done from almost every culture in the world. Um, Going to Australia and teaching there and learning more about the Aboriginal cultures that were there and the different nations of cultures. I thought of myself being wise about history until I went to some of these places and learned that most of what I knew was not just rudimentary, it was incorrect. So being there in that culture and sitting down with some of those elders and sharing stories with them was the way that it happened. My father was a lot like that too. He was into not just African American literature as his profession, but Native American literature, and his work with the Navajo Nation really opened him up to an understanding that before we write our history, we have to speak our history. They were oral history cultures. And my father was sent there for a year to sort of develop the written word as a part of that culture. That would have been back in the 1990s also.
Hmm. Let me, while we're kind of dancing around this subject, can you talk a little bit about how you got started teaching internationally? And then do you find a difference between the two, George? Teaching to the States and teaching elsewhere?
Yeah, the first time I was offered to teach internationally was through this German psychiatrist that I met who had wanted me to come and work in his clinic. And I have just started working in Tallahassee in New York and was not ready to make another city my home place, especially across the Atlantic Ocean. But it was getting me to come to this Greek retreat that he had in Santorini that introduced me to so many wonderful people. And it was at that retreat that I learned that massage was a part of the Germanic culture, much more so than the puritanical English culture that had founded the United States.
Uh-huh.
And I learned that they were more open to massage. I mean, again, back in the early 80s, late 70s, when I was first beginning to practice, our culture here in the United States, maybe only 10% had even experienced massage. We weren't sure of the statistics, but we knew that they were very low. We knew the YMCA was one of the leaders in massage therapy in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s, even in the education. We didn't have a lot of other history that we could say the whole culture is invested in it. In Germany, there was a much larger percentage of the culture invested in what we would now call holistic health. Even the use of a homeopathy as a primary branch of medicine in Germany made them much more open to things like yoga, massage. Trying to think of some of the other. They had a German electric acupuncture, a fellow who went to China who developed a machine that he could do acupuncture with, and on the wall was a form of the body with lights on all of the meridians. And when he would be doing his needling, those lights would either light up or blink. If they lit up, it meant that the power was going through that meridian, that the energy, the chi was going through that energy. If it blinked, it meant that there was a blockage at that point. So even a German scientist had invented a system of acupuncture I had never heard about until I moved there in 1980. So getting used to the really wanting to live and work in a culture where people didn't look at me with a a different kind of disapproval when I said that I'm a massage therapist. This was so big in the field of structural integration that many of us back then did not use the term massage. We used the term body work. We said we were bodywork practitioners rather than saying we were massage practitioners. That became something that we recognized when we developed national certification, that many people had been not using massage because of the negative connotations that many in our society at that time were already invested in.
Right. And then do you find a difference in teaching to international students,
Uh,
George? Um, yeah. What do you
yeah,
think?
well, for me, it meant slowing down, and I had to have most of my early workshops in Germany translated, so I had somebody there to do the translation. Many of them understood English, but perhaps not the anatomical English. So I need somebody from the German culture who could not only translate but understood anatomy also. So it made me slow down in my speech patterns, and early on, it made me question the kinds of phrases that I was using to describe things, because I had American phrases, and the English that most of the Germans knew was a British English. And
Ah,
so even some of the terminology I was using, there was no way to translate it. They didn't understand it. So it slowed me down. I guess when I really felt the big shift in being appreciated was when I first taught um, in Austria, of all places. I was invited to teach at the oldest yoga school in Austria. It's in Vienna. It was created in the 1800s, and there had been a family of yoga practitioners who also were massage therapists who ran this. So they had had over 100 years of family life in this yoga school in Austria. And teaching that group really opened up for me a bigger understanding of how yoga, movement, and massage all were interrelated. It made me think about Joseph Pilates coming out of not just Germany, but he was in England during World War I, where he was put in an internment camp. He was a young man interested in sports and fitness, and he was trying to help the people living in the internment camp find a higher level of health by doing exercise. I think they even used the springs on the bunks that they had in this camp to create resistance equipment that later became a part of the Pilates equipment development. But that the what we must remember, there was a horrible influenza outbreak across the world during World War I. Unfortunately, for all the wrong reasons, it was called the Spanish flu. And it wasn't. It was a flu that many think were started at Army and Marine base camps here in the United States in the South, and that traveled over to Europe and then spread during World War I. Pilates believed in bathing, exercise, and touch therapy. He practiced this on many of the people living in the camp, and that camp had the lowest outbreak of influenza than any other place in England at that time.
hmm,
And some of the history that I learned about it, now I'm questioning whether this history is accurate, was that he was asked by the English government to help develop physical education instruction for the public schools in England right after the war. That's just before he moved to New York and established his clinic there, where he worked with some of the leaders of modern dance. Balanchine and Martha Graham were both clients of his, were supportive of the work that he did. So this involvement with movement and massage, with stretching and exercise, all of it needs to be integrated. When I first saw Tai Chi, I thought that's more dance than it's martial arts. And then I saw the man who started Kripalu Yoga come to Tallahassee. This would have been in the late 80s, Amrit Desai, and do his form of yoga. To me, looked like yoga combined with Tai Chi. And the people that introduced me first to Tai Chi and then to Kripalu Yoga, when they received the work I was doing, said, this is exactly what we're working for. We're working towards this neurosomatic awareness. That perhaps that wasn't the term they used, but they were working towards a higher level of physical understanding of your body. Again, the ancient Greek, the healthy mind and a healthy body, or sound mind and a sound body. So the combining movement, exercise, stretching with massage seem critically important. And then you add to that the hydrotherapy and all of the other areas that we can specialize in. You have a more integrated approach to working with a client's needs.
right. I want to ask right before we move into some closing thoughts, George. I'm curious. I struggle to keep my own story, my own history right in my head. In the conversations that we've had, you seem to be able to recall facts and movements of people, and I'm just curious how do you have all of that in your head, George? Because it's amazing recall that I'm sitting here witnessing as I talk to you.
I am one of the subdivisions of CTE that does not show its effects. I have suffered major concussions from football, from rugby, and finally, 5 weeks before the '04 Olympics in Athens, from a traumatic automobile crash that broke 5 ribs, herniated 2 lumbar discs, and I had the worst concussion I've ever had. Luckily, my memory has not suffered. At least I don't believe that it has. And people are still amazed. I have an older sister who's a year and a half older than me. And many times we'd get together and I would tell her, or I would recall with her stories about our childhood. And I would do this year after year. I would come down to visit her. We'd have these wonderful times together. We'd talk about what it was like to be raised together as kids. Finally, one year, she says, George, I just have to tell you, most of these stories that you've told me over the past 5, 6, 7 years, I don't remember any of them. I
Oh.
have no idea if they're true or not, and I don't know how you remember them. So, for whatever reason, memory was not affected by my CTE issues. Um, but I learned early on, I think from my father, who was also a storyteller, that it's important to share your history. It's important not just to express who you are now, but all the stages of development. And from the first, again, from the first lecture I heard of Eric Erickson, it was about the 6 stages of psychological development of childhood. And everything he said in that opening lecture struck me as being important to who I was, to how I became the young 18-year-old that I was as a freshman at Harvard, listening to him talk and being awakened to all of my history through his theory. So I guess it's just something through my own interest, through reading about it, and whatever the luck is that my memory has stayed intact. When I was listening to Benny Vaughn go through his time with you, I said Benny has the same thing that I do. He remembers all of these things in detail. They meant so much to us when they were happening that they could never leave us. And then I've incorporated other stories, stories of ancient culture, stories of more modern day individuals who were predecessors to who we are. That old thing about we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, that meant something to me. From the time I was a young man, I always honored those who I had learned from, or those, even my not meeting them, simply reading the words that they wrote when they were young men or young women. That had an effect on me. And I always was thankful that I had that opportunity either to learn directly from these individuals or to learn through the written word.
Awesome. And it's impressive to witness. I just have to
Well,
say.
thank you. I'll tell my grandchildren they need not worry about me and dementia, at least not in the immediate future. I will tell you that even my grandchildren, when they were younger and they were living with us in Tallahassee, would say, explain to me, Papu. That's the Greek word for a grandfather, Papu. Explain to me about this thing. And I'd say, you could go to google.com. And they would say, no, we like papu.com. That's a more interesting story to hear than what Google has to say. I will admit there are many times in getting ready for a talk, a speech, whatever. I go and do my research. I go and start looking at things that I knew that I didn't have enough information about. So simply being curious, I think, is a part of being a good historian, or at least having an interest in historical knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm with your grandchildren on that. I vote for pup.com.
Poo.com.
I think that's
I'll try to start that website before you do, before you have to.
yes, beat me to it. All right, let's slide into some closing thoughts if you don't
Sure.
mind. First of all, is there anything that we have not covered yet that we should bring up at this time?
Anything. Well,
Any
there's
concepts, stories, anything else to share?
I probably had them all written down on notes I was taking before we did our initial interview.
Towards the end of our last conversation, you, just in passing, very briefly, you mentioned something about Carlos Castaneda.
I did, yes, one of the early books that my father sent me as an 18-year-old. That book opened my mind up to the idea that there is a way of understanding consciousness that is not achieved only by thought, but by, for instance, incrementally taking, and I know there's a lot of research that's been done and a lot of psychological treatments that are being inspired by the use of microdoses of some form of um, um, psychedelic tool, whether it's psilocybin, whether it's a peyote, whatever it might be. I know that there is a movement in psychology towards using it for trauma, for PTSD, for a lot of issues that have been difficult to work with in the past. It makes me think back to Eric Erickson and that final lecture he gave, saying that the future of psychology is understanding human physiology much better. And then meeting Candace Pert and her Molecules of Emotion was one of the books that really inspired me to start studying the biochemistry more. And yet that's something that's still way off in the distance of my knowledge. It's certainly something that I know is important to what Carlos Castaneda was seeing with his growth, his learning through his mentor Don Juan. So that was important for me, and yet I was in Harvard at a time where Timothy Leary's work was still in the psychological department, even though he had left. Many of his graduate students were still there, and there was an interest in using LSD and other psychotropic medicines to support growing awareness of consciousness and of subconsciousness. It's interesting that that's now coming back into our current history much more than it did in the 1960s and 70s when I was first introduced to it.
Interesting. Yeah. I'll have to get in and actually read some Carlos Castaneda.
Yeah, read it in order. There are several books, I think three in all, and I haven't looked at mine in a long time, so I don't want to mislead you. But find the first one that he wrote and start there and see what you think. And I was not aware of the number of people in literature who had experienced psychotropic models before, going to cultures that used it. Even Aldous Huxley was one that I had admired as a literary giant, and I'd heard some stories from my father about his use of I don't want to call them drugs. I don't want people thinking of them as drugs. They are herbal medicine.
Right.
But I would think that the one thing that I want to comment on the most was the value that I had in others reaching out to me and saying, come on and be more of a part of this. Early in my career, I think I mentioned I was sort of anti-organizations. I was anti legislation about massage. I was anti anything that would tell me what I could or couldn't do with this work. And then as I started to meet other people who were my senior, not perhaps not in age, but in the number of years they had been involved in the profession. Benny Vaughn was the first one that I met like that. But even meeting Elliot Green later on in the 19, a little bit later in the 80s, and he was sort of at the head of organizing national certification. Then meeting Bob King, who I realized his presidency in the AMTA had changed the focus of what the AMTA as an organization could do. Meeting so many wonderful therapists from other states who had already been involved either in education. I remember the first educator I met who had started her own school was Carol Carpenter out in the Oakland area with I want to say it correct, the Natural Institute or the Natural Health Institute. Anyhow, she was one of the first people to talk about the joy of teaching people and of having a school that could offer quality education to so many in her community. I never heard anybody speak about but being a school owner, like I had heard her speak about in the late 80s. So she was an inspiration. And then so many other people through the Council of Schools or the AMTA, or here in Florida, the FSMTA, which, by the way, as an organization is several years older than the AMTA. We had a very good organization here. Even a young therapist, or a therapist of my age, Alex Spassoff, when I met him, he was a member of the board. And I said, how'd you get involved? He says, well, my dad was a massage therapist. He was one of the first several people ever licensed in the state of Florida. And so I knew, here's a generational massage therapist. And I was one of those people, sort of, but my grandmother certainly was not in a massage profession. She was not licensed. She was doing her work underground, much like I did the first 2 years I was involved. But I also thought about the history of the people that came before them. How did Alex's dad get involved? How did my grandmother get involved? So there was always this sense of wanting to reach back and bring more of that history forward. So I hope that others, through your work and through the society's work, get excited about this and start doing their own digging in and finding out what are their heritage stories. And I think that's something we should start using more than just history, is the word heritage. And I like that y'all have used the term archives, because we have to develop archives. That has to be given to. One of the first archive libraries in the world, Alexandria, Egypt, by Alexander the Great. He built a city to have the largest, best library in the world. That was the focal point. And I keep thinking back, another guy as a kid that my father said, you have to learn about Alexander the Great. You have to understand what this young man did to honor his father, King Philip. So I just had, lucky enough, these people around me, whether it was my father, my grandmother, my grandparents, aunts and uncles, who all had their own feeling of what we should be learning. Again, it's something that organizations like yours are really going to help us preserve and hopefully expand.
George, what do you hope that you will leave behind if we stand on the shoulders of those that came before us? What do you hope future generations will say you left behind for future generations?
I've always told my students that I felt it was my responsibility to teach specific techniques with protocols that affect a almost certain outcome. Even in my manuals, I use the term GET. I teach the goal of the technique or protocol I'm going to teach first. I teach the effect that it should have if it's successful. And then I teach all the different techniques that you can achieve those goals and effects. So GET, to get it. I want people to get the work. I want my clients, whether they're athletic or not, to understand I have to teach them more than what I'm providing at the table. So my work in stretch therapy, in the early years, it was hard for me to call it yoga because I wasn't a trained yoga teacher. And some of the places I was working weren't open to the idea of yoga in the 1970s and early 80s. I called it stretch for power. And I wanted to link together the idea that stretching and strengthening the body are shared. That's a common goal. That if we're doing strength work without stretching, we're missing it. If we're doing stretch work without strengthening, we're missing it. So I wanted to bring together strengthening and stretching at the same time. And so that's part of the work, that and the techniques of structural integration. I believe I'm one of the earlier people to train in both the classical form of structural integration, and then with SOMA Institute, Bill Williams taught us a newer form that at that time was actually called soft rolfing, because it was broader, more comfortable to receive. Before any specific work done, the extrinsic work was done well and thoroughly. So I think that my teaching of technique is something that I hope many of my graduates carry on and look back and say, hey, much like James Woslosky does when he teaches some of his work. He says, hey, this is called the velvet glove. I learned it from George Kousaleos when I was a student. I still use it to this day. And I know that that technique will live on beyond me, simply because of how many tens of thousands of people James Woslosky has introduced it to.
Right. Yeah. Lives on.
It lives on. It will live on through my grandchildren.
Yeah, absolutely. George, if you could preserve the story or the history of a practitioner who is now deceased, who do you wish we could really preserve their story?
Without a doubt. Bob King was the owner, along with Jim Hackett, of the Chicago School of Massage. He had become involved in massage therapy through the AMTA, and later became the president. I met Bob when he already was the president. He was already the leading sports massage therapist in the United States, had written the second book ever written about sports massage in the US after Jack Moore, and really believed that his wisdom of seeing the future was critical for us in not just developing national certification and the Massage Therapy Research Foundation, but in organizing how education needs to be more, if not standardized, at least raised to a level that everyone agrees we teach at or above this level. And Bob was a great educator. He was a great inspiration to many. I remember the first workshop I took of his was on the feet, and I had never heard anybody talk so knowledgeably about the feet, so much so that podiatrists were reaching out to him for education. Chiropractors were reaching out to him for education. He was sought after for his knowledge of how to treat flat feet, which he and I both shared. And so I remember sitting down with him and saying, well, my feet received a lot of benefit from the 10 sessions. Show me more. And he did. Bob King and I also didn't realize until we had been together for a while that we shared the same birthday, along with a guy named Stephen Schenkman. Stephen Schenkman, Bob King, and I all involved in national certification. Out of the 10 people there the first day, three of us had the same birthday. What are the odds of that? So I knew that I had a connection to Bob more than just massage therapy. Um, Bob also, most people don't know, was a pugilist, and perhaps his training in boxing. I'm not sure if any of it happened through the YMCA, but I have to imagine that there was probably massage going on in some of the boxing gyms that Bob had trained in his early days as an athlete. So Bob King was an inspiration to many of us. He, and again, the only other person would be Al Drake, the fellow I told you about, who was a blind massage therapist and had served as a massage therapist for 60 years. And I thought, that's amazing, because we had been told in school, many of us had been preached to, most therapists don't make it beyond 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
And here I was working with a man that when I met him, he was in his 45th year, much like I am now.
Yeah. Awesome. Kind of along those same lines, George, who would you encourage to participate in a future episode of this podcast?
We've talked about Pat Benjamin. Certainly, Pat would be one of the people. The other would be Nancy Dale, um, at the Down East School of Massage in Maine. And her knowledge of not just the school business, but of the important gathering of information. Her books have been incredibly helpful to many massage schools over the years. She has a New England approach, a Maine approach that I just love. And she was involved in the development of the Council of Schools in its early days. So educational development was something that she was involved in from the time she was in her 30s. And I think she's one of the better educators in massage therapy, and certainly has a rich history.
All right, awesome. We'll see if we can't get on those two. Tell us what you have coming up next. Do you have anything that you would like to promote, or tell people how they can get in contact with you if they want to learn more about you?
Uh, I still teach both core myofascial therapy, which is a certification program here in Florida. There are a number of therapists I've worked with that this next year we're going to be teaching around the country. My teaching has been minimized over the last few years because of my work with the NFL. So from August until January, I stopped teaching so I can give all my time to my athletes in the NFL. So this spring, next weekend, and the end of March, the end of April, at the end of each month of the next 6 months, I'll be teaching core myofascial therapy classes. And we're always organizing for a year ahead for the work that I teach in structural integration. That's a 10-month program, so that's a little bit more involved. But people can reach me through our website, thecoreinstitute.com, or our Facebook page, SOMA Institute School of Somatic Therapy, or they can certainly call me or reach me by email. I could call me at 850-445-7904. It's easier to text before calling. I'll respond to text right away and we can schedule a time to talk. My interest now with the remaining years I have as a massage therapist, by the way, my father taught into his late 80s and I'm only in my mid 70s. So I feel like I've got a ways to go. My interest has always been to work with newer massage therapists who were just being introduced to the wide variety of disciplines that exist and maybe already have an understanding that the direction that they'd like to go in is more in performance, movement, athleticism, even dance. My earliest clients were ballet dancers, and I learned more from working with them than from any other group of clients I had ever worked with. So people who are interested in that, reach out to me. Be glad to talk to you about it, give you some mentor advice about how to get started, how to reach out to local either athletes or artists in your area. By the way, my first artist that I worked on was a well-known artist in Greece who was of German descent. And I saw him painting at his workshop in Greece in 1980. And he was painting on glass. He had an old window. He was painting on one side of the glass, but you'd have to go look at the other side to see how it looked through the glass. I've got one of his works of art in my house right now that I admire because he was ducking under, and every couple of times that he ducked under, I would see him grab his neck. So I walked up to him and said, "I'm a massage therapist. I'd like to know if I can help you with the neck pain you seem to be having." And just that little introduction, I've never been shy about approaching people and saying, "This is who I am. I'd like to help you." I got to know him so well. And for the next 3 years, going there to spend a month, I worked on him every time. And so that artist opened up to me how much certain arts need massage therapy. In this island I'm talking about, Santorini, unfortunately, right now is being evacuated, has been the last 2 weeks evacuated. Since the day before my birthday, they've had a swarm of earthquakes hit the island, unlike anything in recorded history. Of course, this is a volcanic island. The volcano is still slightly active. There's still sulfur and steam coming out of it, but they've had a swarm of thousands of little earthquakes hit the island in the last 2 weeks. So the place that I learned so much from now is almost empty. It is deserted. And hopefully the big earthquake or the big volcano won't reappear. But I think how fragile our life is. And yet we have this hope, this inspiration, this understanding that whatever we can do to improve the quality of someone's life is going to improve the quality of our life. And so I want to, at this time, for all the hundreds of people I took to Santorini over 12 years of retreats. My wife and I went there 12 years in a row, each time with 20 to 30 massage therapists studying with us, learning and appreciating the beauty of this island and the history of this island. I want to reach out to all of them and say, your work there, what you learned there, what you took back home from there can now be spread around the world, and Santorini needs your help. So for those of us who were there with me or who would like to help out know that there's relief that needs to be done. Relief agencies, the Red Cross, and others are working hard to help what could be one of the great disasters of our time in modern Greece.
Thank you for bringing awareness to that, George.
Sure.
No idea. Yeah, and that's important.
It is important. It is important. I've got a godson still living on that island. I met his mom and dad in 1980 when they were pregnant with him, and a year later I was his godfather. So there's a lot of people everywhere in the world, and I know that's the other interesting thing. Iris Berman down in Miami, another great person for your interviews at some part, and the Educating Hands School of Massage. She started one of the first community outreaches with the Red Cross after a devastating hurricane hit Miami and Homestead in 1992. She had learned from Carol Carpenter out in the West Coast in Oakland what Carol had done in San Francisco after the earthquake that hit during one of the World Series games, and how she was the first one to get involved with the Red Cross. And all of a sudden, massage in the late 80s has a relationship with the Red Cross. And now we're working at Red Cross sites all over the country to help after devastating floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, things like that. So I think there's that part of the history perhaps hasn't been written about as much as we need to. So that's another area that I could add a little bit of my own experience with the hurricanes in Florida.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good call for us to put out, I think.
Good.
Words. Well, George, I do want to thank you for your time and joining us on the podcast. It has been very enlightening and an honor to talk to you and learn more about you, George.
Thank you very much. And thank you to your partners who have created this Society of Massage Archives. It's great work. It's been needed to have been done. And I know through these podcasts, at least something digitally will live on forever.
You have been listening to the Hands of History podcast, a production of the Society of Massage Archives. You can learn more about the Society at societyofmassagearchives.org. We are also on Facebook and Instagram. Do you know someone whose hands have helped shape the practice of massage? If you or someone you know would make a great guest for future episodes of this podcast, please email the Society at societyofmassagearchives@gmail.com. Society of Massage Archives, all one word, @gmail.com.